Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologer Austin Coppock about the astrology of June 2024. Hey, Austin, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Chris.
Welcome back. So,
Thank you.
you've been away for a little bit. We're going to talk about that here in just a moment. So, in the first half of this episode, we're going to talk about astrology news stories that have come up over the past month and just some notes that I wrote down about different stories in the news and what their astrological correlations were. Then in the second half of the month, we're going to get into a deep dive into the astrology of June. So, as always, there'll be timestamps in the description below this episode, either on the podcast website or below this video on YouTube if you want to jump forward to the forecast section. But otherwise, before we get into the news, I want to give just a quick overview of the astrology of June, and then we'll get into the news. So here's the planetary alignments calendar for June. Right at the top of the month, the first major alignment that we have is an outer planet alignment, where the planet Jupiter, which is recently ingressed into Gemini, forms an exact trine with the planet Pluto, which is in early Aquarius on June 2nd. Then the following day, the planet Mercury moves into Gemini, and there's an entire stellium of four planets moving through Gemini during the first half of this month. Shortly after that, Mercury conjoins Jupiter on the 4th of June, and the same day there's a Sun-Venus conjunction, also known as a Venus cazimi, on June 4th. Then on the 6th, there's a new moon in the sign of Gemini. On the 9th, we have Mars finally departing from its month-long transit through Aries and ingressing into the sign of Taurus on the 9th. Then we have a Sun-Mercury conjunction, or cazimi, on the 14th of June. Mercury and Venus together depart from Gemini and move into Cancer on the same day on June 17th. And then at that same day, they both form a conjunction. Then a few days later, we get the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere when the sun moves into the sign of Cancer in the tropical zodiac on June 20th. The following day, we get our second lunation of the month, which is a full moon in the sign of Capricorn. And then finally, at the very end of the month, on June 29th, Saturn slows down in the sign of Pisces and stations retrograde while conjoining Neptune within about 10 degrees. And that is the final major astrological alignment to close out the month. All right, so those are the major astrological alignments for June that we're going to be talking about in this later in this episode. Austin, welcome back. You've been gone for the past couple of months because you've had some major life events and you welcomed a new member of your family.
Yeah, a major life event slash person. There's that toggle on charts, right? Is it a person? Is it an event?
Right.
He's been both a person and an event. And so yeah, Kate and I welcomed our son into the world between the eclipses. Um, Lucian Coppock. He is perfect and beautiful, and I will hear nothing to the contrary.
Right. That's beautiful. Well, there's so much crazy astrology happening like when you were gone. And it was amazing because it was all happening like right when you were welcoming Lucian into the world. That, some of the most significant astrology of the year was actually taking place.
Yeah, yeah, and of course a lot of the like big astrology hit my chart in five different ways because it's a big thing. Like any child coming into the world is a big deal for the parents, but it looked like it might not happen for me. If you met me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, like I'm 45 and I'm a first time parent, so it's unsurprising that it took some big astrology to make it happen.
Yeah, well, there's so much funny astrology stuff, like huge momentous astrology stuff happening around the time that you gave birth that I was joking with you. I came up with a Game of Thrones name for Lucian. So let's hear it. I'm still workshopping this. Maybe people could help add or modify it, but this is what I got so far. Lucian Coppock, bringer of comets, devourer of the sun, breaker of bridges, destroyer of stars, first of his name, because we had like the eclipses going on. There was a comet that showed up. Um, the Mars Saturn conjunction happened in Pisces, and there's an entire like bridge that collapsed. There's also a star that's like going supernova that's about to be visible anytime now. So there's quite a bit going on. I'm sure there's stuff I missed, but those were some of the highlights.
Yeah, I would maybe add to that perfect angel baby pterodactyl.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I like that. I'll work that in. If we could put that in Latin, it'll actually have an even better ring to it. Um, all right. So, well, congratulations to you and Caitlin. Like this is amazing. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what happens as little Lucian grows up and yeah, we see some of those different astrology things play out in the future.
Yeah, it's wild. You know, it's literally like falling in love for the first time because it is falling in love. And also getting a full-time job in a coal mine at exactly the same time.
Right.
So
Uh,
that's the best short version of describing it. It's also, you know, it's my introduction to making my knowledge of astrology useful to raising a child rather than just making it more complicated and anxiety producing.
right. And finding the balance between those two of not going to either extreme.
Yeah, well, just figuring it, yeah, like, you know, because that can, you know, I've faced that challenge with myself. That's literally what you're doing with a client or somebody you're reading for, or looking at world events, right? How can this help me? How can astrology help me understand the world better so that I'm better adapted to it rather than just exacerbating all of my, you know, fears?
Hmm.
Right, and anxieties like that is the once you have a good enough astrology to start making real predictions, then you obtain the power to make your life worse if it is misapplied.
Right. Yeah. With great knowledge comes great power. And then you've gotten to like actually track his transits like in the
Mhm.
short term, which has been a fun experience and like a learning process in and of itself.
Yeah, well, and so some of these not so intense prophecies that I made shortly after his birth ended up being pretty useful. Just like looking at where the malefics are, where the benefics are, and being like, I think every month the moon there is going to be a fussy baby day. And now that we've gotten, I guess two rounds or nearly around two go arounds for the moon, I've gotten to test my hypotheses, and fortunately, unfortunately, I'm correct. Because I mean, the experiential difference between Easy Baby Day and Fussy Baby Day, is huge. It's a significant amount of life energy and satisfaction. And so, at least, yeah, Cranky Baby Day, like knowing, having a good indicator, at least with the moon, as to when the Cranky Baby days are coming and when we're probably in the clear.
Maybe that can be your follow-up book to the republishing of the Decans book can be the Fussy Baby book or something like that. Fussy
Yeah,
Baby Transits.
yeah. What's so the visible lunars are like 29 and a half baby days. I don't know.
Right. It'll be the thing that will replace planets in transit for our generation, like what Rob Hand's planets in transit was for the previous generation. Like your baby transit book will be for us.
Yeah. I'm
All
sure
right.
I'm sure my child would love that. You know, once they grow up and can read. But
Right.
really, but
Yeah.
yeah. No, I mean it's there's a lot to say. There's a lot it's a lot of new experiences. And it's a lot of every so I'm going to say a lot of cliched new parent things. One, I've learned that everybody ever told me about being a parent was right. Like all the cliches are true. And one thing I'm finding is just that everything feels new. Like I went to Norwalk and did some speaking, which I've done an awful lot of. But it was sort of like, but can I do this now? I feel like I went through this irrevocable change and am changed. And so coming back to normal things is like doing them. It's not the first time, but it feels like a much longer gap than it's actually been.
Yeah. Well, you went through truly like a whole eclipse portal and like went in one person and then emerged a different person on the other side.
Yeah, and there's some big transits. Just like one of them. So, within a couple weeks of Lucian being born, Saturn conjoined my natal sun by degree. And that's part of the sun, excuse me, that's part of the Saturn opposite Saturn transit that everybody gets, in their mid 40s. But because I have sun opposite Saturn, that sun can join my natal Saturn. And so I was really struck with the like profound duty and responsibility that having a child is. Um, And so when I was talking to people, parents and whatnot, they're like, "Oh my God, are you so full of love?" It's like, yes, but I'm so full of duty right now. Like you don't know how I didn't know a person could be so filled with duty.
Hmm. Both literally and metaphorically.
Well, I was covered with duty
Right.
and
Yeah.
filled with duty at the same time.
Exactly. All right. Sorry about that. I had to
No,
take that
no,
opportunity.
it was well, I mean it was, and you'll see Saturn, Saturn in a lot of the older texts is like being dirty or doing dirty jobs, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been my skill as as a private sanitation consultant and assistant is it's pretty good. It's
Improved.
improved rapidly.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing also that you were born in eclipse season and then
Yep.
had your first child during eclipse season. So is a great additional demonstration of that principle I've been really emphasizing over the past year of just like people born at the time of eclipses, important stuff tends to happen in their life at the time of eclipses as well, like really important life turning points.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, that's cool. All right. Well, congratulations. Welcome back. A lot of astrology and like world events happened since you've been gone. The astrology's been crazy. Literal, um, the bridge collapse. I don't know if you were here for that with the Mars Saturn conjunction. Also, on the day of the Mars Saturn conjunction, the EPA issued like limits for forever chemicals. The Jupiter Uranus conjunction happened, and there were these huge protests. Everything was very literal and uh yeah, and pretty like straightforward.
Yeah, I've heard you texted me about the bridge thing, which was pretty exciting because I thought Mars, Saturn, and Pisces would do bad water things and disrupt trade. Um,
Right.
and so I've heard the loudest explosions that have happened in the world, but it's yeah, it's been strange to not be constantly watching things and like building my sort of model of astrology in the world in my head every day because I haven't had room. It's been interesting to come back after so much has happened.
Right. Well, we'll look back on some of that here as we go into the news section. So let's transition into that. So these news stories just represent a collection of notes that I took this month when I noticed an interesting astrological correlation with a news story. So this is not meant to be comprehensive treatment of the news. That's not possible. It just represents some notes that I took of sort of interesting observations this month when I did see a notable astrological correlation with something. So one of the big stories that happened this month is that there were these solar storms, these really intense solar storms happened where it was the biggest solar storms in 21 years around May 10th through the 13th. And it created these brilliant auroras that could be viewed in all sorts of different places around the world, much further south than you can usually view these auroras in the sky. And it was due to these big coronal mass ejections that were taking place from the sun that were causing severe geomagnetic storms. So one of the things that was really cool from an astrological standpoint is that this was actually happening as the sun in Taurus was coming into a conjunction with Uranus and with Jupiter in Taurus. So it was actually activating the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And I thought that was really brilliant, both symbolically, just from an astrological standpoint, since these were causing storms that were also sometimes interfering with electronics and satellites and things like that. And that's so notable because astrologers have associated Uranus for the past century or so with electricity and related things. But it also got me thinking about how just, Jupiter is the most massive body in the solar system besides the sun. And sometimes what happens when those two bodies line up, and if there could be any sort of like causal connection in terms of astrology. Like I'm so used to thinking of astrology in terms of working through symbolic means like omens or signs. but that, perhaps there could be some interesting causal things that we don't study or
Hmm.
think about as much.
Because they actually do have gravity and giant electromagnetic fields, and right, like if you looked at the solar system from a distance, you would have seen Uranus, Jupiter, and the sun and the Earth in all one line, which seems like something, well, is something that's physically real as well as being real on several other levels.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So here's the chart for that. Just to go to your point. So the sun, here's May 10th, early on, and the sun was at 20 degrees of Taurus and Uranus was at 22 degrees of Taurus. So it was just like perfectly over that few day period coming into alignment with Uranus. And then Jupiter was still very close to Uranus. So it was an incredibly striking thing. And then you were just seeing these pictures from all over the world of these beautiful auroras that were taking place, and that people were sending in. If you go to like Wikipedia, there's an entry for it that has just a ton of these different beautiful pictures of the effect that it was having on the atmosphere and creating these beautiful sights like all over the world.
Yeah, I remember someone texted me and they were like, "Can you see the aurora?" And I was like, "No, I live in Southern Oregon," because I wasn't tracking with any of this. Because we don't get a lot of auroras in Southern Oregon, but I didn't know that all of this was happening. And then I was disappointed because we didn't get any, but people
Mm,
further south than us did.
right. Yeah. Well, if people in the comments saw, let us know in the YouTube comments if you saw the auroras and like where you're located or how far south you are, because I'm kind of curious how far down it did get in different places. Yeah, so that was just a beautiful astronomical event that a lot of people experienced at the same time in a year where there's a weird number of like striking astronomical events that are happening out of nowhere that like lots of people are witnessing at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that was one of the major events that happened. Um, let's see. Another major news story that happened was the death of the Iranian president, Abraham Raisi, died in a helicopter crash on May 19th, 2024. And the Iranian state media says that this was due to bad weather conditions, due to heavy fog and things as they were flying through the mountains. So, what was interesting about this astrologically is that this happened the day that Mars was conjoining the North Node in Aries. And it was actually a day that we specifically singled out in our last forecast and focused on because we saw that that very same day the moon would move through Libra and would exactly oppose Mars at the same time, which is basically what happened at that point. And in the forums, people had posted the chart. Vandana Gayan actually posted the chart for the first report, and it had the moon almost exactly opposing Mars at that time. So it was a really striking instance of that that also referred back a little bit to the eclipses previously. But that was, you saw that news story, right?
Yeah, that I was tracking because I was just aware of that as a configuration. I was like, "Ooh, that's ugly." I think the day before that, I was just like, "Ooh, Moon Mars on the nodes isn't great." And so that day had gone reasonably well, and I was up at night, was taking a night shift with Lucian. And then up on my YouTube popped up Iranian president dead, like several members of the senior staff died in helicopter accident. I was like, holy shit. I was like, so that was okay for me, but it definitely did something. And it's a good illustration of the why the of how the combination of Mars and the Dragon's Head can be especially difficult because with the nodes and especially the North Node, we're looking at the power of obscuration or not being able to see, which is or, not being able to perceive clearly. Because that's what happens during eclipses, right? Like that's you and I were talking about how I believe Valens refers to them as eclipsing points sometimes, which is what they are. And if you get lost with the symbolism, return to that because that's where it comes from. And so, flying through the mountains in helicopters is inherently perilous, but not usually deadly. But when you add when you add that obscuration, you get a level of difficulty that multiplies the danger. And as I understand it, it was there were three helicopters that were all flying, and when the one that ended up being in a lethal crash sort of disappeared from visibility, the other two tried to circle and find it, but they were unable to do so visually, and because of the ambient weather, like they couldn't, for the safety of their occupants, spend any more time. And so you have that, you have it's not just Mars, or you have the, excuse me, you have the danger of the mountains, you have the storm, and you have the obscurity. And so you don't get lethality without that synergy. um
Right. Yeah, and some of the obscurity at the time was also like, was this an accident or was this some sort of deliberate sabotage of some sort? And the
right,
ambiguity surrounding that, given everything that's been happening over the past month, where Israel and Iran had open warfare basically
right.
the previous month, as well as assassinations between the two countries during eclipse season. And that was something that we said in the last forecast episode about when we started talking about this Mars transit through Aries, and especially when we talked about that conjunction with the North Node, is just that because the North Node is the eclipsing point, and because Mars is moving through the sign where the great solar eclipse just occurred the previous month, that it would tie back into events that occurred around the time of that eclipse. So that was one of the things that was fascinating about it, is it really did. And it raised some interesting things to me about how the North Node really is the eclipsing point, but can refer back to things that occurred whenever the last eclipse was prior to that in the same sign.
Hmm.
So
which
that
which oh, let you finish, go ahead.
so that clearly happened here in terms of Iran was one of the big worldwide things that happened a month ago during the eclipses when Israel assassinated some Iranian generals at a consulate, and then um, Iran retaliated, and for the first time around the time of the eclipses, shot missiles and drones directly from their own territory at Israel, because all previous interactions had been like proxy wars or proxy attacks through other intermediaries and not direct. And that was the big thing that I drew from that in the last forecast episode about what happened in eclipse season. So it's like Iran then came up again when the North Node was conjoined by Mars. But then also within 24 hours, the other thing I noted was that the International Criminal Court issued a statement accusing the leaders of Israel and Hamas of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And they issued arrest warrants for basically like the leaders of both Israel as well as Hamas. So that again referred back to some of the stuff that had happened under the previous eclipses, both the ones in late March and April, but also going back to the previous eclipses when everything started back in October. And I think that was all tied in with the Mars conjunction with the North Node in this really striking way.
Yeah, and so several follow-up points. One, that reactivation of the eclipse points tying into events that happened around the eclipse. That's what's suggested by these older texts that say the solar eclipse will stay active for X 6 months or depending on whatever, but that it marks those degrees and it's going to be active for a while. And Mars in Aries can certainly reactivate whatever. Another observation about just the Ariesness of it. There seems to be a theme with these Aries eclipses, especially with the Rahu North Node in Aries, that hostilities that were maybe in some way indirect are becoming quite direct, which is sort of Astro 101 with Aries. Right. We don't say, well, Aries people, they really mince words. They're passive aggressive. They might be mad at you, but you'd never know it. Quite the opposite, right? Like there were hostilities, but the hostilities became complete or took a step further into being completely overt. And I'm remembering now us talking about the nodes and therefore the eclipses in Aries and Libra, I think last year. And one of the one of the topics was the Aries being the sun, the sign of the sun's exaltation, meaning that we're going to be getting the sun in its exaltation eclipsed. That this would probably be bad for leaders, right? And I think that assassinations and sudden death for leaders, I think assassinations are bad for leaders. It's specifically violence targeted towards leadership, and then also you see the leaders of Hamas and then Netanyahu being targeted not for assassination, but for global moral opprobrium is also bad for leaders.
Yeah,
And then
what is
there's one thing as well that happened recently that I think ties into that, and I didn't know what this tied into until I started talking with you about it. Is that there's been a huge shakeup in Russian military leadership over the last several weeks, which it was just a thing that I noticed that I saw news stories about, but I didn't have anything astrological to say. But if we're looking at a thing that seems a set of eclipses that seems to target leadership, that seems connected, especially if it's targeting leadership in a Mars ruled sign, right? Military leadership, getting replaced rather dramatically.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and it was, the North Node is also traditionally in medieval astrology the head of the dragon, and it was interesting that it was directed towards like the heads of three different
Hmm.
countries of Israel, of Palestine, and Iran. That the head of the organization of all three of those countries received some sort of negative thing almost all at once in the same 24-hour period. So that was striking. And then also, of course, many of those leaders are born at the time of eclipses. So that's the other thing that sort of ties them in with it and has tied them in with some of these recent eclipses where it's like Netanyahu's born the day of an eclipse. Um, the supreme leader of Iran was born the day of an Aries eclipse. And even some of the leaders of Hamas were born around the time of eclipses as well. So that's like tying everything together. And now we can really see and know, and we'll have to track how sometimes exact transits to the nodes on the specific day can refer back to events that originated at the time of the eclipse that preceded that. So that opens up a whole new world of things to study in the future.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Especially, yeah, especially dramatic things like the Mars.
Yeah, for sure. So, and there's all sorts of other terrible things happening and just continued things in terms of that. But those are the main things that I just noticed astrologically that were so dead on in terms of having a specific date that I really wanted to highlight for the purpose of this.
Yeah, it really, yeah, it makes a lot of it clarifies a lot of ideas and principles and just gives you sort of exactly, sometimes astrology just gives you clockwork events, right? It's not always that easy, but sometimes it's that clear, especially if you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Moving on to other news. One of the biggest like social media and like cultural or like pop astrology things that occurred was the like rap battle of the century took place over the course of the past month between the rappers Drake and Kendrick Lamar. And I don't have like a super extensive take on this, but I did notice some actually really striking astrology that I wanted to share that was also tied in with the eclipses. So, for those that weren't following it, these two rappers ended up releasing a series of like diss tracks basically against each other between late March and early May, which ended up pretty nicely getting started under eclipse season. And the precursor to the entire rap battle was when Kendrick took a shot at Drake in a verse in a song titled Like That that dropped on March 22nd, which is just 2 days before a lunar eclipse in Libra, which is actually Kendrick's rising sign, because Kendrick's actually a Libra rising. So he had an eclipse in his first house, and then he does something significant that would mark a turning point in terms of his life and career. So the eclipse is tied in for Kendrick there. For Drake, what was interesting is that Drake was actually born right after an eclipse in Aries. And it was just after the big Aries eclipse that occurred last month that the rap battle really started when the track Push-Ups was leaked on April 13th, which of course is just days after the huge American eclipse that everybody witnessed in across the United States and North America. So you can sort of just like think about that. He was born under an Aries eclipse, and then he basically initiates this battle with Kendrick, which both of them will now become known for under an Aries eclipse. So it's another one of the same things that we were seeing like with your chart.
Yeah. And I was only peripherally aware of this. But when somebody pointed it out, so that started with Mercury retrograde in Aries while we also have the eclipse in Aries. And then it continued well into the Mars joining the fray in Aries, right?
Yeah, that really heated things up and turned it much more intense and much more personal and kind of vicious. So here's Drake's chart, and you can see he has a sun in Scorpio and his moon's in Cancer, but just a little bit before that, you can see in the readout he was born. There was an eclipse on October 17th, 1986, lunar eclipse in Aries. So that was just like a week before he was born, basically. So again, this
So
just like goes
the
to show,
so that's his prenatal lunation,
yeah, exactly.
right? Yeah, one of the other thoughts that I had when that was pointed out to me, and I heard again just some stuff. It appears to me that some people were tracking that very carefully in astrology land and otherwise, and doing the blow by blow.
Mhm.
But what struck me was again just the Mars Rahu, so or Mars Dragon's Head, Mars North Node, is that same obscurity which I talked about earlier, which for the helicopter crash is a storm and fog. Um, what you see relationally is that the nodes, especially the North Node, will when it's combined with Mars, you get conflicts that cross the line because you can't the participants can't see the line, and so it looks like going too far, too personal. The yeah like the rules of engagement for a civilized duel get forgotten in the obscuring heat of battle, and that's something you just see on a personal level with Mars Rahu stuff.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So let's see, other notes. Drake released the track Tailor Made Freestyle on April 19th, and that was the one that had like an AI version of Tupac and of Snoop, which he used just to like digitally recreate them and then to like attempt to use them in a diss against Kendrick. But Mercury was retrograde and it was conjoining Venus exactly that day, and he ended up having to take that track down as a result of like copyright issues from I think the family of Tupac who like threatened to sue him. So that was an interesting Mercury retrograde piece. The only other two interesting astrology things I had to note was one, it was really interesting to see Kendrick's Mercury Mars conjunction in the 10th house come out in this battle. Let me share his chart. So Kendrick has Libra rising and he has Mercury at 16 degrees of Cancer conjunct Mars at 17 degrees of Cancer in the 10th whole sign house. And it was really interesting to see that come out more fully and be activated in this one singular event. Because prior to this, he wasn't really known as like a battle rapper, but instead more of somebody that often focuses on like social issues and is more like more conscientious in different ways. But now this one exchange where he just absolutely kind of like demolished this other guy has now become a key moment in his life, like almost like a singular moment where the power of that conjunction is really striking and notable, and everyone will always remember this event where he got into this rap battle with this opponent of his, and then kind of landed a kind of crushing blow that almost sort of like ended the battle. And I think that Mercury Mars conjunction really came out because he's always been known as like a lyricist and one of the most talented and gifted lyricists, not just of his generation, but potentially ever in terms of rap, which always matched very well with especially his Sun and Venus and Gemini. But this Mercury Mars conjunction really brought out like a different part, and it stamped this event as like a core part of his legacy now.
Yeah, well, just from a transit perspective, you have so much stuff reinforcing that Jupiter in Aries, right? Like the capacity for battle. And that Mars and Jupiter have some very nice mutual reception as well. And as you pointed out, like he's got the North Node there. This is a nodal return for him.
Right, for sure. Yeah, Jupiter overcoming and bonifying those planets there in the 10th house is really helpful in terms of again making him good at what he does. And one of the things that everyone now knows that he can do is if he wants to be, he can be really cutting and yeah, can very effectively like do that part of being a rapper as well, in addition to the other parts which he had already established his legacy on.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So the only other part that I wanted to mention astrologically that I noticed was just, um, Drake is Leo rising and he has a Scorpio stellium in the fourth whole sign house. And since he's Leo rising, having the sun in the fourth house means the ruler of his ascendant's in the fourth house, which represents the home and the living situation. And one of the striking things that actually happened in this battle that I thought was interesting and fitting in terms of that placement is just a picture of his house literally became the album cover for what will probably be one of the most notorious diss tracks of all time. So seeing that manifest in just like a very literal way with him having all those fourth house planets was also very, very striking just from an astrological standpoint.
Right. If you're going to attack him where he lives, then look for the house where the ruler of the ascendant is.
Right. And it's
But
like he's
which
already,
in the fourth is literally where he lives. Right. Some of us live in the ninth or the fourth or the seventh or whatever, but like that's appropriate targeting.
yeah, when it's just good demonstration that yeah, if you've got a lot of like a lot of planets in a certain place in the chart, then that area is going to become prominent at some point. And even if it's like a fourth house thing, sometimes that also can become prominent. He'd already been known for having this just house, this really lavish house that cost, I think, over like $100 million to construct and was like a pretty big deal. But now having it on an album cover and not necessarily in a good way is another striking sort of event that activated all those placements.
Hmm.
So that's all I got for the astrology of that. I know there's like way more I could go into. There's lots of other things that other people have noticed online. So people can check Twitter, especially for more takes on that. But those are some of the main things that I noticed. All right. Other news. May 13th, OpenAI released a new version of their uh, popular Chat GPT AI app where it has more voice features and it also has real-time translation from language from one language to another. And I thought this really was really striking because it was right before Jupiter went into the sign of Gemini, which is one of the signs really associated with communication and with languages. And also with like fluency in different languages or the ability to translate from one language to another. And all of a sudden, with Jupiter now in Gemini, all language barriers are just being demolished suddenly. So it was a really striking example of Jupiter going into Gemini. And then also there was a controversy surrounding it at the same time, because as soon as the demo came out, I immediately noticed it, which was like, that sounds exactly like Scarlett Johansson's voice from the movie Her, which was a movie about like a guy falling in love with an AI voice assistant that came out like a decade ago, and Scarlett Johansson played the voice of the like disembodied AI that became like the love interest of the lead character. And I noticed it right away, and I thought it was really striking that they had used her voice or imitated her voice for the purpose of this, since they're obviously mimicking that film from 10 years ago. But then she came out about a week later saying that they had approached her asking to license her voice and she declined. But then she said that they went ahead and basically just created a version of it anyways, or created a voice that sounded so close to hers that she said that they were like basically ripping her off. And I thought that was interesting as well in terms of the shift of the planets into Gemini and now some like controversies surrounding that, but also raising some questions about some of these AI companies and their sort of ethics basically and how they deal with ethical issues and that not really being a good instance that's like going to give people a lot of faith that they're going to act ethically in the future.
Well, that's really interesting because didn't you just say that one of the earlier events that happened with the Drake thing is he released a song where he had cloned someone's voice or had AI replicate someone's voice without permission, Tupac, right?
Right.
Um, and I also had coincidentally watched a television program where that was just a side joke, but there was an actor was complaining about having sold his voice to a robot and then having to be around this robot that spoke like him and how unendurable that is. And that's this is we're very much in Gemini territory, right? Because with Gemini we have the quick symbol of the twins. What that looks like is often like replicating or doubling. And so when you as we say when that replicating or doubling is like somebody, for example, replicates your book and sells it, but not under your name, like that's Gemini, but that's theft. And then if somebody tries to replicate various significators of your identity, that is identity theft. And the not so wholesome side of Mercury and Gemini is that it is theft, right? And but theft through imitation.
Right.
So I think that might be a theme, especially when we have our Mars in Gemini later this summer.
Yeah. That also reminds me of just some of the stories of like Hermes and like Greek mythology and like the trickiness surrounding Hermes and also theft being one of the significations of Mercury.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
sometimes theft, someone, when we think like the sort of quick definition of theft, or we're like taking something from somebody else, but that like replicating or simulating someone or something else in order to extract from them is very common with lots of different kinds of theft, right? The like the con man pretends to be replicates somebody else, like masquerades as somebody else, meaning they're doubling all of those features. And so, yeah, those qualities of imitation and the action of theft um, go hand in hand really easily. And we did have,
Yeah.
and we had Mars Mercury earlier, and then we'll have Mars in a Mercury ruled sign later. So yeah, interesting patterns forming here.
For sure. And then also the Saturn Neptune conjunction getting closer and closer and just the blurring of what's real and what's not real. And we'll see an intensification of that later in June. But that's also part of what's happening here, as we've been seeing with all the like AI generated artwork and AI generated video, and now people using this in order to recreate people's likeness in something that you couldn't tell the difference between that not being real versus something that was real. That's very Saturn Neptune. There was one positive manifestation of this that I did write down, which was on May 5th. I saw a story saying that the country singer Randy Travis just released his first new song in over a decade after because a stroke had left him unable to speak or to sing. And so the singer used AI to recreate his voice from past recordings. So this is actually kind of a positive example of AI's potential to unlock new possibilities or allow, in some instances, somebody who's become disabled to still be able to profit off their own image and likeness in a way that you could argue is more constructive or permissible or ethical.
Or
Because
wholesome.
sure, yeah,
Yeah, like
yeah,
replacing, like being able to replicate something valuable that was otherwise lost.
right, exactly. So it's like we're going to get both sides of that coin here as we move further and further into the Saturn Neptune conjunction and the blurring between reality and what's not real, as well as Jupiter moving through Gemini and just intensifying the trine with Pluto and intensifying some of the themes surrounding communications, artificial intelligence, language, and different things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I guess we're going to do some of this later, but it is interesting to think that the blurring it gets much more intense because it's been blurry and is blurry, and we can isolate when the Saturn Neptune height of blurriness happens, and we still got a ways to go.
Yeah, for sure. All right. There was only two other little minor news stories, and they were more connected with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction because they were happening in late April and early May, while that conjunction was still very close at the end of Taurus. One of them is that on April 30th, it was announced that marijuana is finally going to be reclassified in the United States to be a lower level drug because for decades now, it's been classified as one of the hardest drugs, like up there with like heroin and cocaine and stuff like that, which has always been a really absurd thing in the US that everyone had always pointed out the absurdity of. But finally, now it seems like some of the restrictions on that are lessening. It's already been legalized in some states, like Colorado, for example, or California. But now it seems like it's moving in the direction of some sort of national lessening of those restrictions. And I thought that was an interesting example of Jupiter conjunct Uranus and Taurus, because one of the things about Taurus is its connection with like plants and with the ecosystem, but also potentially with medicinal things that come from the earth that are sort of like natural medicinal things, is one of the themes that I was picking up on.
Yeah, I think that's like uh a re that the reclassification finally happening, but all of a sudden gives it that Uranus quality. Yeah, and you have the earthy Venusian plant-based thing. Another thing that brings to mind is just Neptune and Pisces. Because since Neptune went into Pisces, a lot more things have become legal. Um, especially especially drug things and in the United States, and almost all of that has been on a state by state basis. And so a question I've asked myself is like, okay, does marijuana become federally legal or decriminalized or less criminalized before the end of Neptune and Pisces? Because we don't have that much more left, and it has some things to do. And Neptune was in a nice sextile with Jupiter Uranus. And so we have agreement between those two agendas,
For
the
sure.
planetary agendas, as it were.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me, there were some things related to that also with like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, where all of a sudden, while Jupiter and Uranus were still together at the end of Taurus, both the US approved an ETF so that people can invest in the second most popular cryptocurrency, which is called Ethereum. But also recently, Trump came out pledging full support of cryptocurrencies, basically. And now it's become a political issue this year that we're going to see expand over the course of the next few months, is both candidates trying to either fully embrace cryptocurrencies in the first presidential election ever, or at least moderate their stances against it, because previously Democrats had been much more pro regulation of cryptocurrencies, or against cryptocurrencies, which has now increasingly become an unpopular position.
Right, right. So the like positioning relative to cryptocurrency now has political meaning in a way that it really didn't used to.
Yeah, I actually realized this past month that that's actually what one of the things that 2024 is going to be remembered by, is when it's going to be remembered for the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, and that the Bitcoin ETF and the Ethereum ETF were approved, which in really simple terms means that all of a sudden people can now invest in cryptocurrencies through the stock market, and specifically they can invest in it through their retirement funds now. And so now there's huge amounts of major companies and like banks and other financial institutions that are buying up cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and stuff like that, which is making the price skyrocket over the past several months. I think that's going to be one of the main things 2024 is remembered for in retrospect, is the year that institutions, especially in the US, finally let up and started embracing cryptocurrencies as a sort of acceptable or inevitable thing. And we'll see an acceleration of that this summer, especially when Pluto retrogrades back into Capricorn, and then Uranus and Taurus comes up and trines it and makes a pretty close trine with it, as one of the final things that'll happen with respect to that Pluto transit through Capricorn, which really started the entire cryptocurrency process because Bitcoin was founded shortly after Pluto went into Capricorn in the 2009 timeframe.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's also the Uranus and Taurus time frame, because Uranus and Taurus wasn't when Bitcoin was invented, but it was
Mhm.
when it became a non-niche interest. And in my research on Uranus and Taurus, um, at the was it 2018, one of the things I found consistently was like significant, how should we say, reorganization of financial and banking things, and that had happened in different ways, different times. Like, is a currency backed by a precious metal? What is it backed by? And that's been part of the question with cryptocurrency, is like, well, what is it backed by? Which is what any currency needs, right? Like the dollar is backed by the most powerful military on earth, right? That's in a sense that, and the productive power of the American people and the natural resources, but like, what are things backed by? Um, and I haven't followed cryptocurrency closely, but what I said back then, which is looking good, was just that we see what it means by the time Uranus is done with Taurus. And so it's interesting to see that, like, this is 2024 is the last year that Uranus is only in Taurus. This is the last full year of Uranus in Taurus. And as you and I were talking about, that hit from Jupiter is sort of the most support that Uranus is going to get for the rest of the time in Taurus. Like, that was good for Uranus and Taurus things, um, like strikes. How about strikes? Labor movement stuff, protests, also cryptocurrency. That's interesting. Even I was telling you that when I was looking over the events of the last month, where the Jupiter Uranus was still very strong. Apparently, there was even a strike. There's a labor strike at the Vatican Museum. And I bet there have not been a lot of strikes against unfair working conditions at the Vatican Museum. And there were
That's
others as
incredible.
well. Yeah, that it stood out. And that's also the Jupiter, you get like a religious thing. But I thought that was worth noting.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, there was an eruption of like so much of that in like different parts of the world, and some of it was visible and like on the news and prominent, but some of the, was easy to overlook or that you didn't even hear about.
Yeah, the times where I like really fine-toothed it internationally, we weren't wrong about what kind of things were happening and when, but there were so many specific manifestations of that that you just didn't hear about in sort of in the surface of English language media.
For sure. One last point about currencies actually that I just discovered recently or came up and I was working on was um, way back. There's like a group of countries called the BRICS countries or BRICS organization that are moving to attempt to move the world away from the dollar as like the primary means of trade. And one of the things I was looking at recently is that they've been wanting to potentially create a new currency, and they announced earlier this year that this new currency may be partially connected to a cryptocurrency that would be backed up or possibly tied in with gold. So I looked into this, and it turns out that they first started having these discussions around the year 2009, which is also around the time that Pluto went into Capricorn and that Bitcoin was also created at that time, or cryptocurrencies in general were created. So there was something that started back then, and this could be another thing to pay attention to this year in terms of Pluto making its last pass through Capricorn, is something related to this and this attempt by these different countries that includes the core countries were like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but then they recently added, I think, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, who are trying to basically move the world away from relying on the US dollar to, relying on some other currencies. So it'll be interesting to see if there isn't some sort of additional final turning point with that that pushes things further in that direction over the next year once we
Yeah,
get a
or
special.
puts a nail in the puts a nail in the coffin of the project, because that I know that the that project has disappointed observers for quite some time with how effective it's been at that. But like, because that's what those endpoints do, is like you're like, okay, this worked, or like this didn't work, and even if we have the same goals, it needs to be done in a different way. And another interesting thing
Yeah,
about
well,
the
I don't think, I mean, if I had to make a bet, I would think it would go the other direction because I think those countries now have even more motivation to attempt to push for that, especially Russia does, but even other countries like China, of not having to rely on the US due to sanctions over the past few years due to war. So we could like place bets on it, but I
Oh
would
no,
push.
I would refuse. I'm
Okay.
just saying, like, when you get those end of the cycles, you get measurable like yeses and nos. And so us coming up on that makes a lot of sense. I would add another thing about the timing. The 2008-9 was also Saturn in Virgo, opposite Uranus, but just on a simple Saturn cycle level, that we're exactly the opposite Saturn point. It's one half Saturn cycle away from that. And as you said, the clearest planetary indicator is that Saturn, or excuse me, is Pluto in a Saturn ruled sign. And so exactly half a Saturn cycle later is interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then also, of course, using the US Sibley chart, which has Sagittarius rising, of course, Capricorn is the second house of the United States birth chart.
Yeah.
So it's also interesting that just this broader question about, the United States has benefited tremendously by having the dollar as the main world reserve currency and currency for trade, but obviously, that would be a major hit if there was the ability, if other countries were able to band together and create an alternative to that that took off, like that would kind of make sense as a potential not good transit in the US, like second house birth chart, if you're looking for something like that.
Oh, it'd be huge.
Right.
Yeah, it'd be gigantic. Absolutely.
Yeah. So things to pay attention to. The next BRICS meeting, I think, is actually in October in Russia. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that around the time of like eclipse season. All right. So I think those are all. Oh, no, sorry. There's one
We have
last news.
one terribly important story.
The this one or
Red Lobster.
okay. Yeah, I spaced that out. You're right. We should have put that at the top of the show. You found this one. This is a brilliant story.
Yeah, and
Set
so
it up.
yeah, so it was recently announced that Red Lobster, which is a popular American seafood restaurant, has had to file for Chapter 11, or bankruptcy protection. And so, that's funny. And there were all these stories going around that it was because the reason they had to file for bankruptcy was because they were giving away too many shrimp, and that the all-you-can-eat shrimp was the you know was the spear that pierced the heart of Red Lobster financially, which I thought was funny. And then it was actually right before the show today, where it occurred to me that this is Saturn in Pisces again. Saturn in Pisces, right? We need it's been demonstrated abundantly that it's hard. It either shows us hostile sea life or bad things happening to boats. And so in this case, it was a seafood restaurant. And what is the sort of the cliche Saturn lesson, where it's like, well, you need to learn to set appropriate limits. And so it was not setting appropriate shrimp limits. Was the story was the was the story about how that happened. And even though it was announced while Mars was in Aries, the last month before that, when no doubt there were very tense conversations happening between Red Lobster executives, was the Mars Saturn conjunction in Pisces.
Nice.
Like the shrimp is killing us.
Right. The downfall of Red Lobster with Saturn transiting through Pisces. That's brilliant.
Yeah, the harpoon right through the heart.
Right. Very literal. That's really continually striking to me how literal everything is. I would, when we got into this like 10 years ago doing the forecasts, I assumed you would have to talk much more metaphorically about some of these transits, much more psychologically. But no, like sometimes it's literally just Saturn goes through the sign of the fish and the downfall of Red Lobster, of one of the most famous seafood restaurants in the United States, basically.
Yeah, I don't know of a larger seafood chain.
Right.
I hear the cheddar biscuits were a favorite. I kind of hate seafood, so I refuse to do the cannibalism as a Pisces. So I couldn't share any fond memories at the funeral of Red Lobster, but I'm sure some of
Okay.
you could.
All right. Yeah. Well, one person's bad transit is another sign's good transit and vice versa. I think that's important. That's the most important lesson that we're learning here today.
Yeah. Thank you, Red
Y-
Lobster.
Yeah. All right, one last news story. This connects with something I noticed last month that happened on the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, where there was that declaration of animal consciousness that was put out by a group of, I think, 40 academics after a conference on animal consciousness. And a bunch of people sent me this story that came up in the news just days later, which was still very close to the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And it was a story about um, an orangutan was spotted in the wild using a medicinal plant to treat a wound on its face and to heal an injury, basically. And the main takeaway from this was basically that they said that the behavior suggested that self-medication is not unique to humans and that other species may also possess knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants. It also, they said, provided valuable insights into the evolutionary origins of wound care and highlights the importance of protecting the habitats of these intelligent and resourceful creatures. So I thought that was really interesting because it was tied in with both, on the one hand, the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus and this broader question about consciousness at this point and potentially more broadly in humanity, like re-evaluating the level of consciousness that non-human animals and creatures have and the broader discussion that's going on about that right now. But also interestingly, the issues surrounding like medicinal plants as like another Taurus thing as
Hmm.
a sort of technology, which weirdly then, even though it doesn't seem like it should be connected, ties back in with the marijuana like rescheduling and
Yeah.
sort of precursor to legalization at some point.
Yeah, like a greater understanding and appreciation for the power and intelligence of the natural world and the complex relationship and the our complex relationships within it and between us and it and the shocking power contained within plants one for various purposes. But that is really really interesting, right? Because tool use has been seen or documented by you know scientific institutions for quite some time, but it's usually really instrumental, like using a stick to do a thing, but understanding that a substance has a subtle power within it, and a cult of virtue is sort of a new level for what's being documented.
Yeah, for sure. And it just raises that broader point that Diana actually made on the last forecast episode is that the reevaluation of animal consciousness is the other side of the coin of the discussion that's already happening on the other side with artificial intelligence and the question of like, is machine consciousness of some sort possible, and what will be humans' relationship to that if it's not treated as the same as human consciousness? Will there still be a point at some point where we have to evaluate the level of consciousness and if it has to be raised above what humans are normally accustomed to treating different sentient entities like? And that's a really interesting thing that'll be an ongoing discussion, I think, especially as Pluto continues to transit through Aquarius.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it'll definitely be a topic.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it for the news for now. Why don't we transition into talking about the forecast for June? Um, First, I want to take a little break. All right, so before we jump into the forecast, first I wanted to mention our sponsors for this month. And our sponsor is actually me for this month because I'm actually running a discount on my Hellenistic astrology course this month, where you can get a 15% discount on it by using the promo code Mercury when you purchase the course. So, the Hellenistic Astrology course is an online course in ancient astrology where I teach people how to read birth charts using ancient methods. And this is basically the course where I teach people how to read birth charts like I do, taking them from basic concepts all the way up through intermediate and advanced techniques. So, as a result of that, it's suitable for both beginner, intermediate, and advanced students of astrology because there's kind of something for everyone. The course is divided into 13 parts where I take people from those basic concepts up through advanced ones. And there's more than 100 hours of video lectures in the course in total. And I'm always adding new lectures to it all the time so that the course offerings continue to expand, but people get grandfathered in basically and continue to receive new updates. One of the reasons I'm running a sale on it right now is because I'm excited to start a new group of students this summer because I've started doing a live series of chart readings where every month we're doing a live webinar where we sit down and I look at the charts of students and we apply some of the techniques learned in the course, and we do specific workshops on certain techniques. So last month we did a workshop on the rulers of the houses in different houses, and I took different examples from the audience live and talked through their birth charts in order to talk about good examples of how that placement works out in practice. So this month we're doing a workshop on the ruler of the ascendant, where I'm similarly going to read the charts of different students in the course and use them as examples to demonstrate how the technique works out in practice. So the course is really amazing. If you have my book and you like my book, you'll really enjoy the course because I actually go into way more detail in the course than I was able to in the book, especially in terms of example charts and demonstrating how the techniques actually work in practice. Just because, like in the zodiac releasing chapter, for example, I was only able to include maybe what was like 5 or 10 charts, but the full zodiac releasing section of the course, I include just dozens and dozens of case studies and examples and really go into the technique in detail in order to show you how to apply it in practice. And I actually recently uploaded a new demonstration of a zodiac releasing chart consultation that I did recently, which is now something you can watch as part of the course to learn how I actually apply the technique in consultations. Yeah, the course has flexible participation requirements, so you can adapt it to your own schedule. I pretty much never run, I do not remember running a discount on the course anytime in the past several years. So this is actually a very rare opportunity just because I'd like to start a new group of students this summer while I'm doing these workshops. So take advantage of it by using the promo code Mercury to get that 15% discount. And you can find out more information or sign up at theastrologyschool.com.
Awesome. Well, and you covered the features pretty well, but I just wanted to add that it's really nice that you're doing live stuff with people now, because that relationship between record, should we say the um relationship isn't the right word, but having both live stuff and recorded stuff and a book, like having being able to engage with the material in all of those ways is so wildly and deeply complementary. And I think it's so good for people's learning process.
Yeah, I mean, most of the course I wanted to design it because everyone has different schedules and different time frames. So I wanted to make it flexible so that the core lectures people can log in and watch at any time and kind of adapt it to their schedule since we all have busy lives and can't be available all the time for live webinars. But then doing this webinar series has been really helpful because then you do get that live component of sitting down and like talking with me directly over Zoom about your chart in some instances with certain students and actually being able to talk to people about their lives is much different than just presenting a celebrity chart example because then you can ask them questions and you can draw out points that sometimes they themselves don't understand about their own chart or their own life, but that once you get the outside perspective from an objective observer, you get a much different understanding of your chart and also how to apply the techniques, which is really valuable.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. When you
Yeah.
have what you have nearly 20 hours just on ZR, right?
Yeah, it was based on I did this OPA retreat where I took a group of 10 students for an intensive that lasted for 3 days years ago. And then I took that 3 day workshop afterwards and I re-recorded it and created a new 18-hour workshop basically on zodiac releasing. And that's the kind of like crowning achievement of the entire course because everything builds up to that advanced timing technique and learning how to use it. But there's so many other prerequisite techniques and concepts that you have to learn first before you get there. But that's where everything fully comes together in that, in what I think is the most impressive or my favorite Time Lord technique from the ancient traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I've explored a lot of techniques and I like a lot of them. Maybe I see some getting to the level of ZR, but I can't think of one in either my Hellenistic or Vedic or medieval explorations that can even remotely claim to be better. Like it's as good as astrology techniques get.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so people can use the promo code Mercury again to get a 15% discount. It's just going to be running through this month only, and you can use it at theastrologyschool.com. All right. What do you have going on this month, my friend?
Well, at some point before the end of the month, I'm going to put up the lectures and the workshop I did at Norwalk for sale on my website. I did a 5-hour workshop on the the celestial medicine of Marsilio Ficino. And it's basically a sort of survey exploration, big dip into Ficino from the remedial and astromagical point of view. For anybody who's familiar with Ficino, there's a lot of Ficino that that you can't cover quickly. And he has an important place in the history of philosophy and there are other Ficinos, but is really my attempt to extract, introduce, and explore the astrological Ficino as a master of Saturnian remedies and really as an astrological magician with a lot of hot takes and a sort of a critique and dialogue with the Pika tricks. So there's that, and then I did a talk that's just strict nerd stuff about planetary strength, looking at the Shadbala or the six strengths measurement that's standard in Vedic astrology, and comparing and contrasting that with how we're evaluating planetary fitness in Hellenistic astrology. And then my third talk is a love letter to the extremely Saturnian, where I explore the Saturn Mahapurusha yoga, which in short is just people whose whole lives revolve around Saturn. And I explore that through the figures of Marsilio Ficino and Friedrich Nietzsche. And so those will be up soon. Um, as far as Sphere and Sundry goes, we are going to be releasing a Decanic series for the first time by the end of the month. And I would also recommend, if people haven't yet, like check out the Moon and Taurus with Jupiter bonus points series that came out a few months ago. It's really good. All of the reviews will convince you if the election doesn't convince you. So if you miss that, like by all means, treat yourself.
Nice. So, and that's at sphereandsundry.com. And then your lectures are going to be available at your personal website, which is austin.coppock.com.
Absolutely.
Nice. All right. I'll put a link to your website in the description below this video, so people can click on that for more information, or on the podcast website in the entry for this episode for your links as well as for mine.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Why don't we transition into talking about the astrology of June at this point and really get into the deep dive? So let me put up a chart for just June 1st to situate where the planets are and what things are looking like at the top of the month. So this is June 1st, about 1 p.m. All right, let's orient things. Where are we at the top of June? I mean, I think the big thing is we're really moving into that entire Gemini stellium, and that's one of the dominant themes at the beginning of the month, especially once Mercury ingresses into Gemini on the second and third. Then we've got four planets moving through the sign of Gemini for the entirety of the first half of the month. So that shift from all the Taurus stuff to the Gemini stuff this month is one of the most, I think, characteristic things of the early part of June.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and this is really the last month of 2024 where we have these truly massive stelliums giving us almost a single sign theme for a good chunk of the month, because we had big Capricorn stellium, big Aquarius, big Pisces, less big but still quite meaningful Aries, and then Taurus. And then we're finally getting done with this everyone in the same pool, and like three or four planets at a time, all operating through the same sign method. And so it's interesting. It's interesting for a lot of reasons. One, it's because it's the last time it's happened this year, which has been the whole year up to this point. And two, it's Gemini, right? And this one, like this stellium, this stellium involves the Sun and Mercury and Venus, but it also involves a Jupiter which just changed signs a few days ago. And so it's still fresh coming into June. And because Jupiter is a yearly ingress, the first week or two, or even the first month, we're just learning about it. And like not only are we getting used to Jupiter doing a new thing, we have to get used to the fact that Jupiter's not doing what it's been doing for the last year, right? Which we oh so quickly come to take for granted.
Yeah, I think, and what's crazy is right out of the gate, Jupiter trines Pluto, so we have an intensification of both. So some of the meaning of the transit of Jupiter through Gemini is going to become its most intense, like right at the beginning of the month when that happens. And I think, especially that Jupiter trine Pluto, which goes exact on the second, should expand and accelerate some of the technological developments related to communications, to artificial intelligence, and also to travel. One of the things I noticed, one of the news stories I noticed, is that there's going to be um, a spaceship that's being launched on the 1st of June, where Boeing's much delayed Starliner spacecraft, which was supposed to launch last month, like 3 weeks ago, but there was a leak and the launch got scrapped. It's been moved to June 1st, where they're launching from Cape Canaveral, Florida. And if it's successful, it's going to open up, it's partially like a rival to Elon Musk's SpaceX. But in terms of transporting people into space and eventually even the potential for like space tourism or travel or things like that.
But you can tell they don't have an astrologer, because if they could just wait one day, they would get Mercury and Gemini with the Jupiter.
Yeah, I mean
Boeing's timing has not been good lately.
it's
If
not a
anybody,
terror.
oh, go ahead.
I didn't think it was a terrible chart though. Like I think if I'm remembering correctly, yeah, it has here, let me show the chart. It has Virgo rising, like the ascendant, if it's on time, will have just switched over to Virgo. And so Mercury will actually be in the ninth house, conjunct the midheaven and conjunct Uranus. And, having the ruler of the ascendant in the ninth house, the place of long distance travel or foreign travel for a spaceship launch is actually not, is pretty fitting for one. And then having all of that other, the benefics in the 10th house is not bad either. So maybe this one will be successful.
Yeah, maybe. I'm just saying, if you were like, I don't know, we're gonna do it this week, you'd be like, well, let's get Mercury and Gemini.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true. And that's actually our election. Well, to your point, like that's my election for this month. Maybe I should actually mention that right now because
yeah, because we always forget it.
we always forget. I'll forget it to the very end of the episode otherwise. Okay. So this is the electional astrology chart for June of this month, where this is the best and most auspicious date I could find for starting different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So the chart is set for June 3rd, 2024 at about 12:05 p.m. in Denver, Colorado for me, but you can set it to the same time. So set it to 12:05 p.m. in your location and then adjust the ascendant until you have about what I have here, which is early Virgo rising, and put the degree of the midheaven on Mercury at 0 degrees or 1 degree of Gemini. So what you'll end up with is this chart with Virgo rising and the ruler of the ascendant, which is the most important planet in the electional chart in some ways, will be at the very beginning of Gemini, applying to a conjunction with Jupiter, which is at 2 degrees of Gemini by that point in a day chart. So in this chart, you make the ruler of the ascendant not only in its own sign, having Mercury in Gemini, also placing it in the 10th house of career, reputation, work, and the public, but also applying to the most positive or most benefic planet in the chart, which is Jupiter at 2 degrees of Gemini. It also takes advantage of that nice trine with Pluto, which is at 1 degree of Aquarius, so that you're taking some of the best things from the Jupiter Pluto trine, especially in terms of communications and technology, and baking those into the chart. And then finally, it also takes advantage of the fact that this is very close to the Venus cazimi that's happening this month on the 4th, where the Sun and Venus are going to conjoin in the middle of Gemini, which is another highly auspicious placement and transit that's taking place at the beginning of the month that you'll be able to use and bake right into your electional chart. So the last thing about the chart is it has the moon exalted in the sign of Taurus in the ninth whole sign house, and it's applying to a sextile with Saturn in Pisces. So this is a very 10th house election. It's very good for career focused matters, for career, reputation, public life. It's also very good for Gemini and Mercury related things, which have to do with like communication, travel to some extent, translation, writing, speaking, and other mercurial things. You almost couldn't get a better Mercury related electional chart. And that's why we've highlighted it this month for this election on June 3rd.
Yeah, it's really Mercury's in really nice condition. And it's worth noting that even though Mercury is in Gemini for the next several weeks, it is quickly disappearing from visibility. This is, this is the last couple days you're actually going to be able to see Mercury rise. And
Yeah.
so get it while it's hot or visible. Get it while it's visible. It's not a very good slogan, but it's sometimes an important thing to do.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it'll disappear from visibility. Eventually it'll apply to square Saturn once it gets closer to the middle of Gemini. And pretty much after this date, not long after this date, Mercury separates from Jupiter. So it's a very small window that you can catch that Mercury-Jupiter conjunction, which is so auspicious for communications. So definitely take advantage of it because this is definitely one of the better electional charts of this year, and things get kind of dicey like later in the year with the Mars retrograde and other transits going on that get a little bit tense and harder to find really good elections for during months later in 2024. So that is the electional chart. That's the primary electional chart that we're recommending for June. But there's actually lots of other great electional charts that we found that we just presented in our Electional Astrology podcast that was just released a few days ago, where I think we presented at least 10 other electional charts at different points in the month for that you can also use for starting different things. So that's one of the benefits of becoming a patron of the Astrology Podcast is getting access to that private Electional Astrology Podcast. So you can find out more information about that at patreon.com/astrology podcast.
Nice.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Just add that, yeah, there's a lot to work with electionally this month in a way that hasn't been true for a while and then won't be true again for a while.
Yeah, it's really been raising this month and the later part of last month with some of the Taurus elections have really raised the principle to me of of collecting or harvesting things while you can. What is that saying? There's like some saying about that, but basically like get while the getting is good because
Yeah, or
there's going to be other times.
strike while the iron is hot. There make hay while the sun shines.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
there are a
that's
couple of
it.
them.
And that's such a good analogy because the sun really is shining right now, and it's a great time to plant seeds that will grow and flourish later on. Whereas there's other times this year, astrologically, as well as just more broadly metaphorically, if you try to plant seeds in the winter, it's not going to grow as well as if you plant in the spring. So this is kind of a pretty close analogy to that this year in terms of the astrology when the good elections they're happening during the first half of this month.
Yeah, and it's really nice to catch Jupiter shortly after an ingress into a sign. Because it's inherent, the beginning of a Jupiter site of a year of Jupiter in a sign is inherently hopeful because you're seeing new possibilities, right? You're not like three-quarters the way through it and it kind of worked out and it kind of didn't, and you just want to get this thing done before it's over. Like it's really like there's that like expansion of possibilities with the ingress is a really nice thing to capture for something that you want to grow.
Definitely, especially compared to this summer which we'll talk about here in a little bit, when Jupiter moves into the middle of Gemini and starts squaring Saturn, that expansive quality is going to get seriously suppressed and contracted, and it's going to have much more tensions. Whereas those tensions are not as prominent now with Jupiter at the beginning of the sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in the live chat, Jane says, "Gather your rosebuds while you may." I think that's a good one.
That's nice. So we've got like the Venus, Sun, and Mars version of the saying, right?
Exactly.
Strike while the iron is hot, hay while the sun shines, and then gather your rosebuds while you may for Venus.
Exactly. All right. So let's move on to other astrology stuff. At the beginning of the month is definitely the lightest and most positive part of the month. With the Jupiter trine Pluto. Do you have anything else you wanted to mention just about Jupiter trine Pluto in isolation?
Well, yeah, I would say that it's great for Pluto. Um, it may be Jupiter will get some benefits, some not. It depends how much Jupiter wants to do Pluto things, but it's an unambiguous good for what Pluto and Aquarius is trying to do. So I don't know if you want to write sci-fi horror. That's a good influence. Or if you're, I don't know, working on one of these new generation of machines that have fascinating and terrifying possibilities. Like it's good for all of that stuff. These like potentially, these things that have a big potential to significantly change or transform the way something works. And so it's great for all of that stuff.
Yeah, especially once Mercury goes into Gemini on the 3rd. Um, I just think the pace of some of these new technological developments when it comes to communications is really going to pick up. We're going to start to see the ability to what that was such a great metaphor with being able to translate from one language to another using a voice AI and just the different possibilities and different barriers to things like communication or language suddenly being broken down because that's one of the things that Jupiter does is it removes restrictions and it
Hmm.
sometimes can liberate you from things that were holding you back. And for some people, language or the ability to communicate or talk to somebody else due to a barrier of language having that removed, I think it's hard to overstate like the liberating feeling of that, as well as just how it will open up so many more possibilities over the course of the next year as Jupiter's transiting through that sign.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of good there. I'll yeah, I mean, I'm just reminded of the internet, and how it's amazing, but being able to hear what everybody's thinking all the time is not an unambiguous good. Um, and that like that's part of the nature of Gemini and Mercury, right? Um, and so like is Mercury a benefic or a malefic? Like, yes, definitely. And in the sort of Vedic standard, like in Parashara, Mercury tends to be a good, right? Like is often counted among the benefics, except when 20 different extremely common things happen where Mercury is not a benefic.
Mm,
And I think I'm willing to go with tending towards the good because it, I mean, Mercury, and especially on the Gemini side, it's fun, it's light, it's expanding your ideas and thoughts. It's great to have conversations. It's clever. We're figuring out how to do new things. And all of that can go sour and does, but is it 50-50, right? Is Mercury completely undecided whether it's helpful or baneful, or does it at least tend towards the good? And at least while Jupiter's in Gemini, I'm going to go with Parasha and say that Mercury tends towards the good, and that
mm.
all these mercurial things will at least tend towards the good.
Yeah, I like that. Um, so communications is a big area. Vandana in the live chat mentions social media, which is another good one, which is a very Gemini or Mercurial type thing. Another area that I could see for expansion would be travel is another Mercury and Gemini related thing. And I definitely expect over the next year to see some major developments and expansions when it comes to travel, especially with the Pluto trine in connection with AI. So one of those I talked on the forecast last month was these electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, which are like drones that people get in and fly around, which eventually will be autonomous. And seeing that really come into the public consciousness over the next year, I would expect to happen. And it'll be interesting to see if there's anything related to that that happens this month as this stellium is moving through Gemini in terms of travel. There's also going to be some new developments with, cars that are driving autonomously and that becoming more common or more prominent would make sense in terms of this emphasis on Gemini and also the connection with Aquarius, which is bringing in the AI component. Um, what else? There's other travel, and the other one, of course, is like the space flight one, which is another wild card in terms of travel that's being expanded at this time as well, especially if that space shuttle launch is successful.
Yeah, definitely. All this stuff. And some of it is new and some of it is some of these are technologies that have been around for a while, but they haven't been used for things that they could be used for, right? Like, and it's sometimes there's a new thing that makes something that's been around for a while efficient and like a market efficient thing for the first time, right? Like VTOL is not a new thing, but like when combined with this, and this, like now it's ready to go, or like now this is ready to go. And that's part of the like Gemini Mercurial thing. There is inventiveness, but part of the inventiveness is I can take these three things that already exist and make a superior tool for the job, or make something new for this precise implementation, which makes it faster and more efficient.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's sometimes the emergence of a new technology, it only results from a confluence of previous technologies that come together or that somebody deliberately combines at a specific point that has unintended growth side effects.
Yeah, like there's a synergy that nobody noticed before, right? Like, because peanut butter and jelly both existed before someone put them together in a sandwich.
Totally. That was probably one of the best. That was probably a good Jupiter transit. What would that be? That'd be like a Jupiter and Cancer transit, I feel like.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Not, yeah, not. Not quite so technological, although, jelly doesn't make itself. There's actually a method. Peanut butter is easier to make.
Right.
Just one thing I would add to that from a like personal or on an individual basis is like what can Jupiter offer you in Gemini? And helping you find the words, which is important for written communication to have the impact you hope, to be able to communicate more clearly what you're trying to say, but also the spoken word as well. Being able to find the words, having a larger I was going to say a larger and more powerful, expanding your personal search engine within your brain so you can find the right words to articulate what you're trying to say is a big thing. And that will be a theme for some people with their Jupiter and Gemini transit.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And doing a lot. When we talked about Gemini earlier this year with Britton LaRue on the Unshaming the Signs of the Zodiac episode, she talked about how with Gemini, one of her key concepts is just it's okay to read like a little bit of a lot of different books and then like move on to the next one or something like that, that you don't have to
Mhm.
fully master something in its entirety throughout like 100% in order to gain something valuable from it. And sometimes there's something to be said for dipping your toe in the water and getting a sense for one thing and then moving on to the next. And that this month has that kind of energy of, moving around and having that almost like social butterfly sort of like quality. But for all of us with both benefics, with Jupiter having ingressed into Gemini and Venus making its cazimi very early in the month, I think that in general, a lot of us, whether we have day charts or night charts, are just going to be experiencing positive, stabilizing sort of growth and development transits in the Gemini sectors of our charts this month, especially in the first week or two. And I think that'll be just experienced as very pleasant and enjoyable.
As a Gemini moon, which rules my ascendant, I would add stimulating to
Mm,
pleasant. And then just one more follow-up on what you're saying about growth in that area and quick learning. Quick learning enough about a thing rather than dedicating oneself to specialization. So
right.
Jupiter is in the sign of Mercury in its detriment. But if we're doing essential dignity, we need to do all of the essential dignity. And so in that first part of Gemini, Jupiter is the ruler of the decan, and it has a bound there, and it is the triplicity lord. And so if we're doing like point systems, it's actually got a shitload of power. That is the technical readout according to Alberoni.
That is what
And
Dorothea says.
yeah, that's what Dorothea says. And
Right.
I know somebody, I married somebody who has Jupiter there. And Kate is so quick on the uptake with like learning enough about a thing to get good at it and do it quick. It really is great for that, like, yeah, for that, it's Jupiter and especially early, Jupiter and Gemini understands the 80-20 rule, right? Where it takes as much effort to learn 80% of the thing as it does to, excuse me, as it does to learn the remaining 20%. Or the remaining 20% takes 10 years. The first 80% takes, 1 year. And so there's like an efficiency of mental effort, where like, unless you're going to be doing the one thing for 25 years. You need to know enough to do what you need to do with it rather than, pretending or again, shaming oneself or feeling guilty for not being a 20-year expert on every single thing.
Yeah, that that makes a lot of sense. And that sometimes I've grown to appreciate that because it's a little bit different because like Scorpio and Gemini are disjunct, in conjunct signs. And with Scorpio, I sometimes have the tendency to want to go in deep and get to the bottom of something and not just to have a surface level of understanding of things, but to try to truly sit with it and master something before moving on. But you can't always do that. And sometimes you really have to pick your things to focus on. And sometimes it's okay to just like learn 20% of something so that you're proficient in it and then move on to the next thing. and find a balance between those two things. So I think this month we'll be focusing more on that 20% of things and enjoying lots of different things in some specific area of our life that is the Gemini part of our chart.
Yeah, yeah. Exploration, curiosity, encountering new ideas and ways of doing things. Some is like there'll probably be a lot of like, oh, well, that's a better way to do that, and just picking that up and moving on, right? Rather than like I'm going to sit and study this, for at least 6 months. Because sometimes you
Yeah.
just bump into a better way of doing something that you're already doing. It's like, oh, that's clever. Why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, exactly. So, tied in with that, another very positive transit and a very notable transit that happens at the beginning of the month on the 4th of June is that the Sun and Venus form an exact conjunction, which is also known as a Venus cazimi, when Venus plunges into the heart of the Sun. So this marks the end of one synodic cycle for Venus and the beginning of another, one cycle with the sun, which will mark a new epoch for things like relationships, for themes related to equality, as well as more broadly, I think the position of women in society in general. And I found actually an interesting news story that right at the beginning of the month, Mexico is actually hosting its national elections, and the two primary leading candidates in the Mexican presidential election are both women. So basically, at the beginning of the month, coinciding with the Venus cazimi, Mexico's probably going to elect its first woman president, which I think is really striking, both as a transit of Venus in general, but it's also really striking if you think about just the history of Mesoamerican astrology that goes back hundreds and thousands of years, which has always been very much centered around the Venus synodic cycle, which includes the retrograde periods, but also the conjunctions with the sun. And in fact, that's what some of the stuff surrounding like 2012 was back
Oh
in
yeah.
2012, is it was actually tied in with I think a conjunction in Gemini at the time.
Yeah, it's all Venus math. Yeah, that's a great set of points. And yeah, what a nice thing. And so here's a question. So like in setting the synodic cycle of Venus, right? Do you treat the superior conjunction where Venus is on the other side of the sun, this one, as the major cycle setter, or the inferior conjunction, which is when Venus is retrograde between us and the sun, or do you treat each as being able to sort of tell you about the next 9 months? Because I tried to sort of decide between them because they're both so powerful, and now I just sort of treat them as splitting the total cycle, where this Venus Sun conjunction in Gemini is going to set the tone until we get the next Sun Venus conjunction, which will be the retrograde one in, I believe, April of 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely relevant that starts, there's little beginnings and then little culminations or endings on either side of those cycles. And then it builds up to bigger and bigger ones sometimes until eventually you get to the fact that this conjunction that's happening this month in June of 2024 is a repetition of a conjunction that happened 8 years ago in June of what is that, 2016? But also the halfway point between those was a retrograde conjunction in June of 2020. So, and therein I found actually two interesting repetitions. So one of them was, Venus's general connection with women in ancient astrology and in the Western astrological tradition. And 8 years ago, when Venus made this conjunction last time, I just mentioned how the first woman is going to be elected president of Mexico under this conjunction. Well, 8 years ago, we almost had that in the US because in June of 2016
Hmm.
was when Hillary Clinton got enough votes or delegates in order to become the first woman nominee of a major political party in the United States, and therefore had the best chance at becoming the first woman president in US history.
Yeah,
So
and it
there's
was
an
maybe going to do that 8 years before that in 2008.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, but then lost to Obama at that point. Yeah, that's a really
So I
good.
don't mean to be rude. I really, all this talk of Venus and moisture attendant to the planet, I really need to put water in my eyes.
Okay. Yeah, eye
Apologies
drops.
for the introduction.
So that's an interesting point, though, in terms of this repetition, that sometimes it has to do with like women or the place of women in society in general, or women progressively taking steps towards achieving greater equality with men in different parts of the world around the time of these conjunctions. So I think that's one theme that we're looking at with this conjunction clearly. But then I was also thinking about this and what happened 4 years ago, which is when the Sun and Venus conjoined in Gemini in June, but it was when Venus was retrograde. And June, of course, of 2020, that was actually when like the George Floyd protests were taking place and
Mhm.
the Breonna Taylor protests and a lot of the things with Black Lives Matter and different movements surrounding that, which was a push for, on the one hand, more the most broad thing you could say about a push for greater equality in the United States in terms of that, and that moved and also impacted different parts of the world. So I think that's another theme. There's some underlying theme also about equality and rebalancing the scales in order to achieve that, that really comes up under this Sun Venus cazimi.
Yeah, I think that's one of Venus's core significations. We always talk about Venus in relationships, right? But what is the one quality that relationships need to be good? They need to be fair, right? And under various conditions, but especially under these cazimi conditions where the Sun and Venus are focused in a single minute of a single degree, what has not been fair, and is therefore poison to relationships, whether they're collective or individual, comes up, right? And the like the presence of unfairness as well as the desire for fairness is hyper focused by having like the one moment when the sun truly has Venus's back.
Right. Yeah. So one of the nice things about this conjunction that it occurs at 14 degrees of Gemini on June 4th, but that's also basically the same day that Mercury is conjoining Jupiter exactly at 2 degrees of Gemini. So that seems like another indication that this is going to be a positive, affirming aspect or affirming configuration that's happening on this day around June 4th. And it's one of my favorite lineups this month that looks relatively positive or looks relatively optimistic. I think the only thing that's a little bit tricky is that immediately after this, Venus does apply to that square with Saturn, which is at 18 degrees of Pisces. So there is, although there's like a lot of optimism surrounding this conjunction on the 4th, there's still some obstacles or some barriers that will arise a few days later when that alignment of the squares starts coming into view. And this will be a thing that'll be happening over and over again this month with all of the planets in Gemini is running into that square with Saturn and Pisces and some tensions that will arise as a result of those restrictions or that dampening influence of Saturn from that sign.
Yeah, when I think about Pisces Gemini relations, which I think a lot about because that's where the two lights are in my chart. Um, Gemini is quick and fun and mobile, and Pisces, but especially Saturn and Pisces, is so heavy and so dampening to feeling like, you know, uh, it's so yeah, it's so heavy, it weighs, it slows down the speed, which is natural to Gemini, but part of that speed is also some of the emotional tone of Gemini, where you feel free. When you feel unencumbered, you can move quickly, and moving quickly and lightly and easily feels wonderful. And Saturn is this obligation to attend to, I don't know, how have we described Saturn in Pisces, right? Like I believe I referred to it as like the melancholy Leviathan, right? Like the sadness iceberg. It's heavy and deep. And so sort of reconciling these like bursts of fun, light, heartwarming, heart-centered, especially with Venus Sun stuff, like with with the melancholy iceberg, is part is an important challenge for this month.
Yeah, those are great keywords. And it reminds me, this is the end of one cycle of Venus, so that there will be, in some ways, a looking back and taking stock of how far you've come over a certain period of time, whether that's locally over the span of the past however many months since the last Sun Venus conjunction, whether it's in the more long term sense of the half cycle of 4 years ago since June of 2020, or even if it's the more long term cycle of something that started 8 years ago, the last time there was an exact conjunction of the Sun and Venus that was direct in this part of the chart in June of 2016. So, this looking back and taking stock of how far you've come, but also since it's a conjunction, it has the sense of laying the seeds and the foundation for a new cycle that's going to grow and develop and mature over a much longer span of time of either a year or 4 years or 8 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's nice.
So that is awesome. And that's one of our best and most favorite aspects of the month on the 4th. And
Well,
that
and
actually,
sorry, go finish. Sorry, I just had one more thing to add.
I was going to take us into the new moon.
It's two sentences.
Go
It
ahead.
just with the Venus Sun, um, the cazimis are intensely private. Venus is in a very strong position, but it's completely invisible, and so it's often internal or in regard to close relationships. Like it's the whole seed of a thing, but the seed is invisible, right? That you literally make the seed invisible by planting it, and so it's not the time where something becomes really public and blooms, but it's that most crucial, intimate, and hidden time of planting.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've realized over the past few months that that's just an inherent thing with conjunctions in general, which applies to like the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions, where in the episode I did with Tarnus and in his book, Cosmos and Psyche, he has an entire chapter about how Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions sometimes coincide with scientific discoveries that are announced or made under Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions, but they're not fully recognized or widely seen for what they are until sometime later on, so that it almost has this sense of getting overlooked at the time. And I think that's also the case with eclipses, as we've seen, of sometimes starting something major, but it's not clear what was started in your life at that time until later and how significant it was, that you can't see that until retrospect. I think it's because every conjunction is an occultation, where literally one body is moving in front of another and obscuring it. So even though it's the beginning of a new cycle, when you plant a seed in the ground and you push it into the dirt, the plant that it will become eventually isn't visible at first.
Right, but it's the one moment that makes the whole thing possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So everybody should pay attention to that as the beginning of a new cycle, especially for people with night charts of something very positive in your life starting at this time. And it may have to do with relational dynamics, but there's lots of other Venusian themes that can also arise just depending on what house it's in your chart. Because if it's in like the 10th house, it could be career related. If it's in the fifth house, it could relate to children. The 11th house, it could relate to friends, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And then here's the Venus retrograde graphic from the Anana and Venus retrograde episode I did with Demetra last year. And where we're at right now is this conjunction, the superior conjunction, which is when Venus is on the other side from the sun compared to the Earth, because the Earth is like up here at the top. So it's the sun that will be obscuring Venus in this instance with this conjunction. But then whatever starts in your life at this time, some of the other Venus turning points, like when Venus stations retrograde, when Venus does the retrograde conjunction in the future, and then when Venus eventually stations direct, all of those will be important parts of the cycle where whatever it is that is planted at this time in your life will grow and have crucial turning points at those different stages.
Yep.
All
And
right.
so the next big one is in 9, 10 months, right? So it's this until we hit the retro in next April.
So April is when the next conjunction will take place.
Yeah, it's stations in, yeah, I think it's stations maybe late March, but like the conjunction I think is in April. It's in
Okay,
Aries. So
got
yeah,
it.
and it's about like 9 months between inferior to superior and back again.
Nice.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, that takes
And
us to our first
go ahead.
that takes us to our first lunation of the month, which occurs just a couple days later, which is a new moon in the sign of Gemini, which is actually closely conjunct Venus at the time. So this is what the chart looks like. Mercury's already separating from the conjunction with Jupiter, but it's still close. And the sun, the moon, and Venus are all conjunct at 16 degrees of Gemini. So all of that energy of the stellium of planets moving through Gemini just gets really concentrated here at this point at this lunation.
Yeah, it's what I was just thinking is there's so many new beginnings in Gemini at different time scales, right? Like we have the Sun Venus cycle restarting in Gemini. We have Jupiter beginning a new year in Gemini as the month begins. And then there's the monthly cycle in Gemini, and then we will talk later about how the Sun and Mercury restart a cycle in Gemini. And so, that's how many indicators for new start in Gemini?
Right. Yeah. Just a ton of them, like all month of endings and beginnings.
Yeah, and so yes, this month is hyper Geminian, but we also will have that like things growing from that hyper Geminian, I'm going to pretend that's a word, seed for all the length of those cycles, like shorter for the moon, slightly longer for Mercury, a whole year for Jupiter, and then slightly under a year for, or just under a year for Venus. But like these Gemini signatures are not going to go away as soon as planets move into Cancer.
Yeah, that's a great point that it's leaving a sort of permanent imprint in that spot in our chart.
Yeah. Yeah, like somebody did a lot of crazy work on the garden that's going to bloom at several different timing increments. I wish somebody would do that for our garden. We've been so busy. Sorry.
So one of the things I like about this new moon is immediately after the moon conjoins the sun, it applies to conjunction with Venus. So this new moon is primarily characterized by that sun Venus cazimi, which is still within a degree. They're all at 16 degrees of Gemini. So it's just re-emphasizing many of those themes that we talked about, and it's imprinting them more permanently on the next month ahead in terms of whatever the relational dynamics were that came up for you during the Sun Venus cazimi on the 4th. Just get further pressed into this chart. The only difference is that because everything is at 16 at this point, it's all now within 2 degrees applying to a square with Saturn. And as soon as the moon completes that conjunction with Venus, it then immediately applies to that square with Saturn. So for me, that's bringing up, on the one hand, the dynamic of a Venus-Saturn square, where Saturn, tends to have a cooling effect that whereas Venus wants to relate and create relational dynamics and connect people or unite people, Saturn wants to cool things off. It wants to push things away. It wants to negate some of those relationships, or at least it wants to hold them at arm's length to create a certain amount of distance between you and another person, so that in the immediate aftermath of the new moon, part of the dynamic may be some cooling of certain relationships as a result of that Saturn square.
Yeah, yeah. The way I was thinking about it is, so with the Venus sun that is then emphasized by the moon joining them. This is almost too simple to say, but I think it's totally worth saying, is that the importance of communication and being able to talk about things in relationships and not just like romantic ones, professional ones, wherever the stuff falls for you. And then Saturn is that big, heavy, potentially emotionally charged thing. And the challenge is, okay, you think communication is important. Can you talk about that? Can you figure out how to have like a good conversation about that? Or is that too forbidding? It's, do we need to stay on the surface because it goes too deep, and so we need to avoid it, or can we get in there?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, and sometimes, you can try to talk your way out of something or intellectualize it or try to talk through a conflict, but sometimes no matter how much you talk, that can't remove the emotional component of feeling greater distance if that's the overwhelming feeling that's arising between two people, especially emotionally, if you're feeling distance or you're feeling even a repulsion or a desire to pull away or pull back, sometimes that innate feeling, once developed, you can't always like intellectually like talk yourself out of that or talk two people out of that.
Yeah, you have to like go into what created that and
Hmm.
hopefully not make it worse.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Oh,
So
also, well, also like emotionally heavy, but also that can be like talking about responsibilities and expectations, which also matter with relationships.
yeah, that's a great point. Setting better boundaries, setting better expectations, trying to adhere to those and making agreements through talking to talk out what the rules and expectations are so that they won't be um, violated or they won't be treaded upon, which can create further like emotional or uh, spiritual distance between two people.
Yeah. And with Saturn Pisces, it's definitely like, I imagine like freezing, where people like the further and further away you get from somebody, if like you have lots of like enough, like maybe they're not big bad interactions, but like they start stacking up and people just kind of free, they mutually freeze one another. We do that on purpose. We call it freezing a person out. But the melancholy iceberg, right? Chill Saturn in a water sign. They would like to
Mm.
be oceanic and embracing, but
Right, but that's chilling out or colding out. I think that's a really great thing. And Beth in the live chat mentions vulnerability, which is another good keyword for that. There's also I continue to just see with Saturn and Pisces ever since that went in a year ago, and it really intensified last winter around the time of the Saturn station. But just different people expressing, like I'm mainly seeing it on either social media or YouTubers and stuff like that, just expressing exhaustion and like feelings of almost like philosophical or spiritual or career exhaustion of doing something for a long time and no longer feeling the same spirit surrounding that. And I think that's tied in with Saturn and Pisces, and it'll be interesting to see more people perhaps talking about or articulating some of those feelings of whatever that exhaustion is and whatever the source of that exhaustion is coming from with Saturn and Pisces for individuals, and then attempting to articulate that and how that's creating a difficulty in terms of going about
mhm.
one's normal business.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have some people who took big breaks coming back to explain that more thoroughly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or finding the balance between talking about it and doing the work with Gemini versus taking the time for rest and healing and relaxation with Saturn and Pisces.
Yeah, because even though they have negative connotations, darkness and silence, which are Saturn things, are the preconditions for healing the mind in a lot of cases. Like you need to rest and just, no more bright images, no more thousand voices, right? Darkness and silence are sort of like the one thing that any like meditative or spiritual retreat needs to be effective.
Right. Yeah, for sure. One thing I want to mention before we move on, I forgot to mention about the first woman being elected president of Mexico coming up on the Sun Venus conjunction. Inauguration Day occurs in October, and it's going to occur the day of a Sun Mercury cazimi. And it's also going to occur one day before a solar eclipse takes place in Libra the very next day.
And it's a Sun
So
Mercury cazimi in a Venus ruled sign, right?
in Libra, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Isn't that brilliant? Like I thought
It's
the
elegant.
astrology, yeah, very straightforward. So pretty good astrology. All right, so let's move on from the Venus cazimi. Things take There's a bit of a shift and there's a tone change that occurs just a few days later when Mars shifts into Taurus on June 9th. So Mars wraps up its, what is it, like more than month long transit through the sign of Aries that really kind of culminated in some ways with the conjunction with the North Node in the middle of Aries. And, it was also rustling up. It was reactivating a lot of the eclipse things because Mars was transiting through the sign where the eclipses had just taken place the previous month. So here we're finally done. Once Mars leaves Aries and moves into Taurus, we're finally done with eclipse season and the activation of that Aries Libra axis of our chart in terms of, at least just in terms of planets, planetary transits. But now Mars moves into a whole new area as it moves into the Taurus section of our chart. And unfortunately, the opening part of that, as soon as it moves into that sign, is 2 days later on June 11th, Mars immediately squares Pluto, which is at 1 degree of Aquarius. So our entrance to Mars and Taurus is a Mars Pluto square that occurs right at the very beginning, which is, as we've learned over the past year, not a very fun aspect at all. And what I wrote down for this was that Mars immediately forms a 10th square with Pluto and Aquarius, raising issues related to the use and abuse of power, going overboard to achieve one's ends, and dealing with existential threats in some cases, as broad sort of like archetypal themes that we've seen come up with Mars Pluto conjunctions and squares and other aspects.
Yeah, and I would also add some of the stuff that I said earlier about Mars and the North Node applies in that I see under tight Mars Pluto configurations, sometimes conflicts or disagreements obtain in an unnecessary intensity. And Pluto certainly has a similar power to obscure as the nodes. And so, and you will, and as a result, sometimes you get that going over the line because of becoming temporarily unable to see the line.
Mm. Right, that feeling of like seeing red and then like doing things in a fury, but sometimes like going too far in the process of that.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes just feeling like things are a bigger deal than they actually are. Because
Mm,
it's connected to some sort of, some concealed reservoir of feelings. And so whatever thing feels like a big deal, and then, you get that obscuration of the situation. And, sometimes you get escalation from people without meaning to. They're not even sure why it was so intense. But then you get also real power dynamic stuff, right? Because a lot of power is not visible because it's actually a more powerful position to be invisible, right? You can do lots of
right.
things if you're invisible that you can't do if you're visible. And so we have this really consistent thing with Pluto and like real power, right? Like the not the rich celebrity whose names we know, but the people whose net worth is 1,000 times them whose names we don't know.
Right. Sometimes power likes to cloak itself, and sometimes the most powerful people are the ones that know that and are sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes. And that's definitely a dynamic with Pluto in terms of issues of like control and manipulation and power plays, and sometimes not acting directly, but instead acting covertly or acting indirectly. And sometimes that can be really hard to deal with on the receiving end because it's not always clear then what you're dealing with or where it's coming from.
Yeah, yeah. And so Mars Pluto brings that up, and it brings up the reality of that, and it brings up the fear of that, right? Which, is its own is its own poison, right? Am I
Mm,
being manipulated? I didn't think I was, but maybe I am being, like that's, a lot of the cruel human interpersonal tricks depend on some level of concealment. Somebody's doing a favor if they literally just tell you that they're trying to control you, right? But who
mm,
does that?
right. Yeah. So that's a rough like opening, especially in the first 2 days of that in basically June 9th, 10th, and 11th when the aspect culminates, and then it starts to dissipate a bit over the next few days after it peaks on June 11th. But it's
It's nice that it doesn't last for most of the sign, but it is an unpleasant introduction for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and that's the opening of like Mars moving through Taurus over the next couple of months, where one of the things that's interesting about that is now Mars is building up to conjunction with Uranus. So that's another part of that energy that we immediately have to contend with is that as soon as Mars goes into Taurus, it's co-present with Uranus. So it's building up to a Mars-Uranus conjunction that will culminate in July, I believe.
Yeah,
Um,
mid-July.
Mid-July, okay. So part of that, though, then also the other thing we have to take into account about that transit is what it's happening in the absence of, because we've had Jupiter transiting through Taurus over the past year. So whatever like difficult transits, there's been this positive ameliorating or counteracting influence from Jupiter most of the time. But what we have here this month is both the departure or removal of some of that positive or counteracting energy from Jupiter and the introduction of this more rough, difficult, tense, conflict oriented energy with Mars moving into that sector of our chart and Mars moving into that sector of like the chart of world events.
Yeah. Which makes me wish that I had looked back at all the couple times that Mars had been in Taurus with Uranus when Jupiter wasn't there or aspecting. Because we probably delineated that a couple times on the podcast, like 2 years ago, 4 years ago, even 6 years ago, maybe.
Well, I mean, one of them was really famous. One of them was January
So,
6th. Remember, it was
oh,
Mars was at
the first ingress.
yeah, the first
Right.
ingress was like Mars was at 29 Aries, and then it switched over into
Yep.
Taurus that day, the day that the bunch of Trump supporters went to the Capitol and like raided the Capitol building. That was probably the Mars ingress, like what,
Oh,
four
well,
years
yeah,
ago?
yeah. Thank you for remembering. And we got like the dude with the like the bull horns as like the shot that everybody remembers that like was emblematic of that, right?
Right.
Which Jupiter wasn't there, right? That was Jupiter in Taurus was has been trying desperately to provide a little chill over the last year,
Mhm.
and it's a little concerning is that that's what things look like with Jupiter trying to provide chill.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and one of the things that was notable about that event that I remarked about at the time was it was surprising also because it was one of the few times where it seemed like Trump, because it also, since he has Leo rising, it moved into his 10th house that day. And it was
Hmm.
one of the few times where there was just like immediate backlash. And it seemed like he'd gone too far for once because he had given a speech that led to all of that right before it happened, and that he was receiving actual like consequences for. Um, and that was an interesting, so it'll be interesting to track his transits. He's actually like leading in the polls right now in terms of the swing states for the presidential election. And the Republican National Convention is actually going to take place, I think, really close to the Mars Uranus conjunction that's going to occur in July. So for some reason, that
Isn't
convention,
isn't that his midheaven is like 25-ish Taurus,
yeah, it's around there.
which is where Mars and Uranus meet up. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's
Fortunately,
really,
we should definitely cover that next month because
yeah,
that's mid-July, but yeah.
we'll talk about that a lot. Jane in the live chat says yes, his midheaven's at 24 Taurus. So we'll talk about that because it's also weird because then you have the Democratic National Convention that's happening in August, and that's happening right on the Mars Jupiter conjunction in Gemini, which is square Saturn.
So I don't, yeah.
Yeah. So both of those are going to be kind of a hot mess this summer, and it will be interesting to
I,
track the
I
astrology.
I'll ride along with you on that prediction.
Okay. Yeah, you'll second that. Um, All right. So Mars and Taurus, are there other things that we need to say about this as a broad term transit
Yeah.
that's going to be happening?
So I have one thing to say is I don't like the square Pluto, and I really don't like the conjunction with Uranus, but
Mhm.
there are 20 or so degrees between the two, and Mars chills out for a little bit before it gets crazy again. When once once Mars has obtained some distance from the square to Pluto, as we'll see later in the month, Mars gets some nice sextiles with Venus and Mercury in Cancer, and there's like a temporarily chill period for Mars, which it'd be great if it was longer, but I'll take what I can get this year because this it's just been Mars doing something crazy since the year began.
Yeah,
And
that's a great point. And also, it's like a contrast with the fiery impulsiveness and the chaoticness of like Mars conjoining Aries that happened over the past month. At least there's some, even though the opening square with Pluto is not going to be fun, nor the conjunction with Uranus, there's a little bit more chill and a little bit less of that fieriness once Mars moves into Taurus.
that's one of I would say that's one of the advantages of Mars not having overwhelming essential dignity. Like Mars doesn't need any help to set fires in Aries, whereas Mars and Taurus, if we want Mars to be like the most dynamic and explosive and amazing Marsy Mars ever, might disappoint. But if we would like maybe a few less fires and the pace to slow down a little bit, then that Mars being in detriment in Taurus, but still being comfortable by triplicity, is actually a better thing than Mars, being super strong in Aries or Taurus. It's like, oh, thank God you're not at peak strength. Like that can be an advantage. It's descriptive of something we may want.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. All right. So that's happening. And then a few days later on June 14th, we get the Sun Mercury conjunction, which is the Mercury cazimi at 24 degrees of Gemini on June 14th. So this is again, this is probably the last major peak of some of those Gemini significations of like communications really being at their high point as Mercury resets its cycle with the Sun on this date.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's, I guess, our fourth big resetting things into Gemini, right? Jupiter moves in, Venus conjunction with the Sun, new moon conjunct both the Sun and Venus, and then the Sun conjunct Mercury, which is nice. It gives it's Mercury, like it's okay. So how do we think about all this? Mercury is so good at figuring out what to do with things, and if this is the case, what path do we take?
Right.
And in some ways, it's going to bring it all together as well because all of this has been happening in a Mercury ruled sign, right?
Yeah.
So Mercury really brings it home, or locks it in.
Yeah, I think this is the central turning point with respect to a lot of that stuff because after this point, everything, all the inner planets start moving into Cancer, and we start getting this flowing away from the Gemini energy of the month as we move into the second half of June.
And there's and it's interesting because it ends up marking a really meaningful difference between the first half of the year and the second. Like we're done with all of the crazy pileups for which were, good, bad, and other. To me, the second half of the year looks very distinct astrologically from the first. And so it's interesting we have all of these resets culminating in this Mercury Sun conjunction here on the 14th.
Yeah, this range here, once before everything moves out of Gemini, is like the tail end of the really just amazing electional charts for the month. And then things kind of get a little bit dicier after this, not just in June, but in the rest of the year.
Yeah, and so what do we like? So what do we think about the fact that instead of occurring square Saturn, I mean, technically it is, but it's departing. Both the Sun and Mercury are moving into that square with Neptune in the last 10 minutes of the sign of Pisces.
Of the last 10 minutes. So yeah, so Neptune is right at the tail end. Well, that's leading us into, and we can go into that if you want, just the
Yeah.
conjunction. Yeah, okay. Before we get there, just mentioning Mercury and Venus meet up in both square Neptune. When they get to the end of Gemini, they reach the same degree at approximately the same time on the 16th and 17th, and then they both ingress into Cancer at the same time and form a conjunction at 0 degrees of Cancer on June 17th. So that's one of our notable aspects of the month. On the one hand, there's some weird issues with communication, dishonesty, not seeing things for what they really are, issues with boundaries due to the Sun Mercury conjunction at 29, or Venus Mercury conjunction squaring Neptune at 29 Pisces, that's happening there on the 16th to pay attention to and try to avoid miscommunications or deceptive communication around that time. But then that conjunction that occurs on the 17th is kind of nice, where we have the flowing together of the planet of communication and the planet of relationships and relating.
Yeah, the Mercury Venus conjunctions are common and always nice when they happen. And it's nice. They're both still invisible at this point, but working their way back into visibility in the western sky, which will, in the evening sky, which we'll see both by the end of the month, Mercury more clearly than Venus. But they've got this sort of new deal worked out. And Venus Mercury is so nice for, on a simple level, like connecting, like how you would like to relate to people with the words you actually use, like connecting the intellect and the heart, connecting like in Mercury Venus with lot formulations it gives you it's the combination that you need to successfully technically execute a thing that you would like to be beautiful or cool looking, right? Like it connects the aesthetic and the technical form and function. And so it's good for all sorts of things.
Yeah, it makes me, I always think of like T.S. Eliot, who has a Mercury Venus conjunction on the ascendant and was a famous poet, um, or other people, and just the presentation of not just, Mercury on its own is communicating something, it's transferring something from one place to another, but Mercury together with Venus is doing it with style. It's
Hmm.
instead of communication, it's putting it in the form of a poem and making it not just informative and transferring knowledge, but also making it beautiful or making it have aesthetic appeal at the same time.
Yeah, Ficino, in describing different types of intellectuals, he's like, okay, so all the intellectuals, which he calls acolytes of the muses, right? But those who aspire to knowledge, he says, well, they're all Mercury ruled. But if the person is particularly charming and persuasive, and artistic in the delivery, then we should look at Mercury Venus. And if, they are serious and willing to pursue subjects past the point that would be good for them, then we should look at Mercury Saturn.
Hmm. In the live chat, Vendetta mentions that it's diplomatic or diplomats, and that's actually a good signification for Mercury Venus coming together. It's like concord or coming to an agreement about something.
Yeah. 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 No, it's
So
great.
yeah, so that's a good aspect that I highlighted this month. And that brings us to our second lunation of the month, which occurs on the 21st, which is a full moon in the sign of Capricorn, which occurs just like a day after the ingress of the sun into Cancer. So by this point, both Mercury and Venus are transiting through the sign of Cancer, and the sun is in there as well. One of the things I like about this time frame is Mercury is just coming off of a sextile with Mars, which goes exact on the 20th and 21st. And there's a great directness or mental acuity about like a Mercury Mars sextile that I really appreciate.
Yeah. Especially kind of yeah, it's Mercury Mars, which when they're when they're conjoined or they're opposed, it's too much. But like a little bit of Mars can be nice, especially a little bit of Mars sextile both Venus and Mercury with Mars in a Venus ruled sign. And there's also a little bit of Mars also adds it adds a note of pragmatism. Mercury's interesting in doing stuff, but Mars is the problem solver. And so Mars will make sure that what we're doing and what we're thinking about is actually going to address problems and undo them. And so
Hmm.
both of them, and that Mars being in a nice trinal relationship with the full moon, while the full moon is, highlighting the Venus Mercury Sun on the other side, it's extremely workable.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, the there's some of the positive things. The other positive thing about the full moon is once it goes exact at 1 degree of Capricorn, the moon then applies to Venus. So it's applying to a positive, more or less positive configuration with a benefic after the full moon. Although before that, the actual degree of the full moon, both the sun and the moon are coming off of a square with Neptune, which is so late in Pisces that it's really still aspecting the first few degrees of the cardinal signs. So I think that's something to pay attention to, is that part of the signature of this full moon towards the end of the month is the square with Neptune. And because Saturn is getting ready to station towards the end of the month, and Neptune's also getting ready to station the very beginning of July, they're both being, that Saturn Neptune conjunction is being empowered. So there's something about, especially the Neptunian functions of illusions, of having difficulties telling what's real versus what's not. Some of the different like AI stuff in terms of blurring the distinctions between reality and the imaginal realms is going to become much more prominent around this time towards the end of June and beginning of July.
Yeah, one of the things I fear with that Neptune winning at the very end of Pisces to square all these planets after they've had all of this thinking and figuring things out and planning in Gemini is that some of the clarity will just seemingly dissolve. Because sometimes, sometimes it's like we have like should we say like straightforward Neptunian forces where it's like a lie or it's misinformation, or it's a misunderstanding or whatever. But like sometimes it's more subtle and it just sort of like the clarity just goes away. Like your brain, you can't remember. Um, you know, I thought I figured, it felt like I figured it all out. And now I'm having, like, I lost that motivation or I lost that clarity. Um,
You
whatever
know,
that is. Well, like whatever the vector of that is, because Neptune is so good at destroying all of the neat plans and categories, and like sequencing that Mercury is great at creating.
that makes me think of, with having the intense cluster of Gemini stuff and the advances in rapid development in communications earlier in the month, and then all of a sudden running into all these Neptunian things later in the month. It makes me think of how the concerns about like the developments in AI and application to social media in order to influence people, or in order to do things like influence the election or something like that, and that's not part of what we're seeing here. Is we're seeing like technological developments earlier in the month, and then we're seeing some sort of reaction to that or some sort of side effect of it that's causing a blurring between what's real and what's not real.
Right, right, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't thinking about it in that context, but that makes a lot of sense. But yeah,
yeah.
there's that like it's just that like, oh, I thought we were getting all this figured out, and maybe none of it matters, or maybe that was all fake, or maybe it really isn't fake, but you encounter something that makes you think that, oh, well, maybe maybe none of like maybe that's not useful and it's the way to go. I really don't like Neptune's ability to hamstring Mercury stuff, Mercury clarity.
Mm. Yeah. So, and then also just with Saturn stationing in Pisces, that's really going to intensify, and we're going to see some news stories that evoke some of those significations again, which have continually had to do with like water, dangers surrounding the water, poisons or pollutants in the water. A year ago, when Saturn first stationed in Pisces, that was when that week the submarine fiasco happened, where there was that
Yeah.
submarine that imploded with the millionaires that were aboard it, that were going towards the Titanic, and you had those different like fears surrounding what it would be like to be trapped in a submarine.
Hmm.
So we'll probably see an intensification of some of those significations and things again here.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably not great for the waterways. Not hide your shrimp.
Yeah, hopefully no major shrimp disasters.
Well, hoard your shrimp. We learned about shrimp boundaries from Red Lobster.
That's true. That's true. All right. And then, yeah, so the struggle to distinguish between what's real and what's not. Um, what else is going on here that we need to mention? This
Well, maybe
lunation.
just a little bit on like the tonal change when Mercury, Venus, and the Sun all pile into Cancer, and we have a lunation on that axis. You know, Cancer Capricorn is in many ways the opposite of Gemini in terms of mobility. Like
Hmm.
Cancer Capricorn are both interested in picking a person, picking a place, and investing heavily in making that fruitful and fortified. Like Gemini is so exploratory and all over the place. Whereas, of course, after that, with Cancer, it's like, what and who am I actually going to invest in? And Capricorn being on the same axis, is more about how do I like fortify this place, and Cancer is how do I make it a nice, like, healing, like a place that feeds me, that's nurturing. And so we go from lots of movement and exploration to really being pushed to lock into something and invest in something.
Hmm. I like, yeah, the term invest that you're using there. I really like that. And that's raising a point that I wanted to make about that I realized recently with Jupiter moving into Gemini. This summer, it's going to move into a square with Saturn, but also eventually also a square with Neptune. So this is important because a few years ago, when Jupiter was in Pisces, conjoining Neptune, that was when the inflation rate shot up in the
Oh
United
yeah.
States. And so part of Jupiter in Gemini, even though there's a lot of good things with that transit, I'm actually concerned that part of the downside of that transit could be continued issues or a resurgence of issues with inflation and some tensions then in the economy as a result of that, with Jupiter, the planet of like growth and expansion, coming into tense or harsh aspects with Saturn, the planet of contraction, and Neptune, the planet of inflating things, of imaginary things, and of a loosing of boundaries.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, like, what does Saturn have to say to Jupiter in that square once they get closer? Like, not so fast, buddy.
Right. Yeah, not so fast. Like let's pump the brakes a little bit here. I know that's one of the issues is they didn't raise interest rates recently, or there are issues with that because they're concerned about, or they didn't lower interest
Right.
rates because they're concerned about inflation still being an issue or coming back. And yeah, I'll be following that really closely as Jupiter inches closer and closer to Neptune and Saturn over the course of the next few months, but we may see the first inklings of that. I feel like here in late June and early July when Saturn and Neptune station simultaneously, and also for the first time come within 10 degrees of a conjunction for the first time in this cycle.
Yeah. Well, and you made this point to me when we were preparing, like this is as close as they've gotten so far. We're going to get multiple exact conjunctions, but I mean, we saw Saturn Neptune stuff like within a week of Saturn entering Pisces when they were 20 plus degrees apart. And
Right.
like this just slightly over 10 is as close as they've gotten. And so it's a slow moving show. It's going to take 5 years to watch every season. But we're getting really, really close to probably we're if we're in season like we're getting into season two. Season three is when it gets wild. But like things are escalating. And so those Saturn Neptune themes, especially with them both stationing at the same time, which they'll be doing for a while. They're stationing less than a week apart, and will continue to do that for the next several years. It's worth watching.
Yeah, definitely. And this also, in terms of this is Saturn, it's only been in Pisces for a year now. So this is one more check in to see what the themes of contraction are doing right now in the Pisces part of our charts. For some people, it's like a contraction in terms of putting you in positions of being in greater authority and having greater, um, as you were describing like earlier, in terms of like having a baby and now all of a sudden being in a position of needing to take care of everything much more than you've ever had to do in your life.
Yeah, like accepting a profound responsibility, but then figuring out how to carry that with some measure of grace.
Yeah. So having greater responsibility in this area of our life and having a check-in about that where there's another important turning point in terms of those cycles of responsibility, as well as addressing sometimes fears or challenges or setbacks that arise or have arisen in that process since March of 2023 when Saturn first moved into that area of our chart, and thinking about what topic or what house is associated with that part of our birth chart. This will be a really important check-in as we're now what, like two-thirds of the way through the process. When does Saturn depart for the final time and move into Aries, like a year later?
Not until the end of next year. Next year is split between Saturn Pisces and Saturn Aries. We do a Saturn Aries relatively early in the year, but then it comes back to Pisces.
Got it.
And so, for my planets in the middle deck and immutable sign brethren, get ready for round two with Saturn's retrograde. Saturn retrogrades back to 12. So if you have planets earlier than that in Pisces or earlier in that mutable signs, like you're actually kind of done. In a way that if you have middle stuff like 12 to 19, you're going to do another 2 rounds. And I would just say on the topic of like, what is that Saturn representing? Like the challenges and the fears, and some of it, which came up with Saturn earlier, is just exhaustion, right? If you're
Right.
carrying a lot of weight, like physically or emotionally or intellectually, um, and you're not used to carrying that much weight, like you might need to change habits in order to actually just be able to do the work without being crushed under it.
Right. Like realizing one's limitations and when you've gone too far and when you need to pull back and reallocate resources in some area of your life.
Yeah, or that equally that, and is there a way that I can learn to carry more weight without breaking down, right? Which is the
Mm,
whole idea of strength training, right? But I think that that applies to other places, right? What do? I need to put this down, or do I need to work on how to carry more?
right. Yeah. All right. Well, those are good words to end with. So I wanted to do a summary of just some of the aspects really quickly, unless you have anything else you wanted to say.
No, not at all. Sounds good.
All right. Here's my summary. I was going to do this at the beginning, but I used it. I forgot, so I'm going to do it here at the end. Here's the major aspects of June. We got the stellium in Gemini in the first half of the month, Jupiter trine Pluto right at the beginning, Venus cazimi in Gemini right at the beginning. Then on the 9th, Mars moves into Taurus, which is a definite tone change in the month. And at the end of the month, Saturn stations in Pisces conjunct Neptune. So in terms of positive and negative aspects. The most challenging aspects for me are these ones. It's the Venus and Sun square Saturn on June 8th and 9th. The Mars square Pluto, especially, is probably the most difficult aspect of the month as soon as Mars ingresses into Taurus on the 9th. But that aspect peaks around June 11th, and that's going to be, I think, the roughest one this month. The following day, Mercury squares Saturn on June 12th, which is not helping with the Mars Pluto square. Then the Mercury Venus simultaneous square to Neptune on the 16th and 17th is tricky for communication and relationships. And then finally, Saturn stationing on June 29th, as we were just talking about, is an intensification of some of that challenging energy at that time. In terms of positive aspects, the most positive aspects this month is Jupiter trine Pluto on June 2nd is a great aspect, the Venus cazimi on June 4th, and the simultaneous Mercury conjunct Jupiter, which also happens on June 4th, then followed by the Mercury cazimi on the 14th, Mercury conjunct Venus in Cancer on June 17th, and finally, there's a very brief but kind of lovely Venus Mars sextile on June 28th, 29th, which is a nice little aspect, although I'm not sure to what extent it's going to be overshadowed a little bit by Saturn stationing at the same time. But nonetheless, it's a nice little aspect with reception.
Yeah,
Yeah,
nice list.
thanks. So that is the overview, and that is it for our astrology forecast for June of 2024. So thanks for coming back and joining me again. It's been, Diana actually was amazing and really stepped in
I'm
and
sure.
just did a brilliant job of stepping in during a really tough time in the year where there was just like so much weighty astrology going on.
Yeah,
So
I didn't envy whoever whoever got the chair for those months, but I was confident Diana would do a good job.
Yeah, she definitely did. So on the one hand, it was great having her. It's also nice to have you back. I'm glad to hear you and your family are doing well, and I'm excited about seeing the growth and development of that since you've also started some new cycles during eclipse season that'll grow and develop in very literal ways over the coming years.
Indeed, I've got some pretty good baby pics.
Nice, nice. All right, awesome. Well, thanks for joining me. Your websites again are austincoppock.com and sphereandsundry.com, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And as for myself, you can find me at theastrologypodcast.com. My course, which is on sale for 15% off, you can get that by using the promo code Mercury at theastrologyschool.com. And thanks to all the patrons that joined us today for the live stream. This has been really awesome. And I'm actually going to be doing more live streams where we're reading the charts of listeners of the podcast and patrons of the podcast in particular over the next few weeks as something that we're doing. We're looking into doing a Jupiter and Taurus retrospective where we talk about how that transit worked out in each individual person's life and certain houses that it transited, so that we can also get a preview of what it's going to be like when Jupiter goes through Gemini in different people's charts over the next year. So
Nice.
people can, yeah, it's going to be really fun. So people can join us for that live stream. It's going to be a private live stream by becoming a patron of the Astrology Podcast at patreon.com/astrology podcast. But otherwise, that's it for this episode. So good luck in June, and we'll see you again next month for the forecast for July. So good luck and take care. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, and Kwatsi Ali Barohu. If you're looking for a reliable astrologer to get an astrological consultation with, then we have a new list of astrologers on the podcast website that we recommend for readings. Most of the astrologers specialize in birth chart readings, although some also offer synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Find out more information at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.